She was dying, and she knew it, and the last thing the Duchess of Ashworth used her remaining breath for was not a prayer, not a farewell, but a command disguised as a plea, spoken to the one man in all of England who had never once in his life been told what to do with his heart. If this is your first time on this channel, please subscribe and join thousands of others who gather here for stories that refuse to let you go, because this one, from its very first moment, will not let you go either. The winter of 1843 had arrived without mercy over the Ashworth estate. It came the way certain griefs come, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, settling over the ancient stone manor like a sheet drawn over a face. Snow had buried the formal gardens. Ice had silenced the fountains. The great oak trees that lined the carriage drive stood stripped in black against a sky the color of pewter, and inside the largest and most silent bedroom of Ashworth Hall, a woman was taking her leave of the world one shallow breath at a time. Her name was Catherine, Duchess of Ashworth, and she had been beautiful once in the way that certain rare women are beautiful, not merely in feature or form, but in the quality of her attention, the warmth she extended to every living creature that crossed her path, from the highest lord to the lowest scullery maid. She was 34 years old. The fever had come in October and simply never left, burning through her reserves of strength the way a slow fire burns through the last of the winter wood, steadily, patiently, and without the slightest regard for what would be lost when it was done. The room smelled of beeswax candles and dried lavender and the particular, terrible sweetness that clings to sick rooms in their final hours. 3 candles burned on the writing table near the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall in silence. Inside, 2 people occupied the room, the Duke and his wife's maid. Edward Ashworth, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, stood at the foot of his wife's bed with the posture of a man who had been raised from earliest boyhood to show nothing. No fear, no sorrow, no confusion, no need. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a kind of face that in repose looked carved rather than born, all sharp angles and compressed lines, the face of a man whose interior landscape had been walled off so long that even he had partially forgotten what lay behind the walls. He was 38 years old. He had been married to Catherine for 11 years. He had not been, by the measure of romantic novels or drawing-room gossip, a passionate husband. But he had been faithful. He had been present. And in the private and unwitnessed chambers of his own chest, he had loved her, quietly, imperfectly, and with a steadiness that he had never once thought to name aloud, because naming it would have required a vocabulary he had never been given. He was not prepared to lose her. He understood, on an intellectual level, that he was about to. He had spoken to the physicians. He had read their expressions before they composed them into professional neutrality. He knew. But knowing a thing and being ready for it are 2 entirely separate countries, and Edward Ashworth stood at the foot of his wife's bed like a man stranded on the border between them. Clara Voss stood to the left of the bed near the headboard, a small basin of cool water on the table beside her, and a cloth folded neatly over her arm. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a German clockmaker who had come to England when she was 7 and never quite left, settling in the village of Ashworth with his quiet wife and his quietly remarkable daughter and his extraordinary collection of timepieces, each one ticking away in perfect, independent precision. Clara had entered service at Ashworth Hall at the age of 16, had become Catherine's personal maid at 18, and had been, in the 10 years since, as constant a feature of the Duchess's daily life as the morning light through the east windows. She was not, by the conventional measures of the era, a striking woman. She was of middling height, with dark brown hair that she wore in a neat and practical arrangement, and gray eyes that were striking only in the sense that they seemed to see considerably more than most people's eyes saw, a quality that had unnerved certain members of the household and endeared her to others, and that the Duke had, in 11 years of passing her in corridors and receiving her household reports, never once paused to consider. He considered it now, briefly, only because he could not look at his wife's face any longer without something inside him threatening to crack along a seam he could not afford to crack along. He looked at Clara Voss instead, and found her watching Catherine with an expression of such unguarded grief that he was forced to look away from that as well. It was Catherine herself who broke the silence. Her voice was barely a voice anymore. It was the idea of a voice, A thread of sound stretched thin across the enormous distance she was already beginning to travel. Edward. He was at her side before she finished the word. He had crossed the room without being aware of crossing it. The way a man moves toward the thing he fears most because the alternative is standing still, and he has never in his life been capable of standing still when any action, was available to him. He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand in both of his. Her hand that had once been warm and capable and was now light as paper, light as the snow falling past the window. "I am here," he said. The words felt inadequate. Everything felt inadequate. Language itself felt like a structure built for lesser occasions. Catherine's eyes, still remarkable even now, still carrying that particular quality of warmth that had defined her, moved from her husband's face to the figure standing at the left side of the bed. She looked at Clara for a long moment. Then she looked back at Edward. "I want to ask you something," she said. "You may ask me anything." He meant it. He would have promised her the moon and the stars and the systematic dismantling of his own pride if she had asked for it in that moment. He was not, in that particular moment, a duke. He was simply a man watching something irreplaceable prepare to leave the world. Clara. She said the name as though it were a complete sentence, as though it contained everything necessary. The Duke did not move, did not look toward the maid. His eyes stayed on his wife's face. "She is no one," Catherine said, each word carefully rationed, drawn from a reserve that was visibly running low. "Her father is gone. Her brother is in Bremen. She has given 10 years to this house. To me." A pause. A breath that cost her. "She is extraordinary, Edward. She is the most capable, the most loyal, the most—" Another pause. Her eyes closed briefly, then opened again with what appeared to be sheer force of will. "You do not see her. You have never seen her. But I need you to see her." The Duke said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was beginning, with the particular dread of a man walking toward the edge of something, to understand where this was going. "Marry her." Catherine's fingers tightened around his with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere outside her physical body entirely. From will, from love, from the fierce and final insistence of a woman who had spent her life caring for others, and was spending her last conscious moments doing the same. "Not today. Not tomorrow. I know you. I know how long it takes you." The ghost of something, a smile, perhaps, or the memory of one, moved across her face. "But promise me, Edward, when you are ready, when you have seen her, promise me you will not let her be alone." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the snow seemed to pause. Edward Ashworth looked at his wife's face. He looked at the 10 years mapped there. The dinners, the journeys, the arguments, the reconciliations, the particular and unremarkable and utterly irreplaceable texture of a shared life. He looked at her, and he felt the crack widening along that interior seam, and he did the only thing he could do. "I promise," he said. Catherine exhaled. The tension in her hand released, not in the way that tension releases when a fear is resolved, but in the way that tension releases when a task is finally, completely done. She died 4 hours later, just before the church bells of Ashworth Village struck 3 in the morning, while the snow continued to fall and the candles burned low, and Clara Voss sat beside the bed with her hands folded in her lap, and the Duke stood at the window with his back to the room, looking out at the white and silent grounds of an estate that had never, in all its centuries, felt so profoundly empty. He had made a promise. He had absolutely no intention of keeping it. He was, after all, a duke. And she was, after all, a maid. And grief, in his experience, made men say things they would not, in the cold clarity of morning, be held to. He was wrong about all of it. But it would take him 10 years, and the near loss of the one thing he had not known he needed, to understand exactly how wrong. The morning after the Duchess died, Ashworth Hall woke up and did not know what to do with itself. This was, in its way, remarkable. The estate had stood for 3 centuries. It had weathered wars and pestilence, and the particular English talent for surviving catastrophe through the rigorous application of routine. It had outlasted 7 generations of Ashworths, each one leaving their particular mark on the stone and timber and carefully tended grounds before departing for whatever came after. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a house that should have been undone by the death of one woman. And yet, the kitchen maids moved through their morning tasks with the slow, uncertain quality of people performing actions they had memorized, but could no longer entirely feel. The footmen stood at their posts with expressions carefully arranged into blankness, which was itself a kind of expression. The expression of people who had been told their entire working lives that feeling was not part of their professional brief, and were now discovering that the instruction had its limits. Mrs. Penworth, the cook, who had served the Ashworth household for 22 years and prided herself on a temperament as reliably steady as her bread, had been heard crying in the larder at 5:30 in the morning, and had denied it to anyone who mentioned it afterward with a ferocity that foreclosed all further inquiry. The house felt the absence of Catherine Ashworth the way a clock feels the removal of its most essential gear, everything still in place, all the mechanisms intact, but the animating principle gone, and the silence where the ticking used to be somehow louder than the ticking had ever been. Clara Voss felt it differently from everyone else, because she had known it was coming longer than everyone else, and had spent the last 3 months quietly, methodically, and with great personal cost, preparing herself for it. She had sat with the knowledge of Catherine's dying the way one sits with a lit candle in a darkening room, aware at every moment of the diminishing light, measuring what remained, trying to memorize the warmth before it was gone. She had not slept the night of Catherine's death. She had sat in the chair beside the bed for an hour after the doctor had come and gone, and the Duke had retreated to his study, and she had held Catherine's hand, cooler now, but still the hand she had known for 10 years, and she had said everything she had not said while there was still time to say it. She had spoken quietly and without expectation of response, the way one speaks at the end of things, when the words are no longer for the person they are addressed to, but for the person doing the addressing. She had told Catherine that she had been the finest woman she had ever known. She had told her that she had made Clara believe, in the years when belief was difficult, that a life spent in service to something genuinely good was not a diminished life, but an honored one. She had told her, finally, that she would be all right. She was not entirely sure that was true, but she said it anyway, because Catherine would have wanted her to, and because saying a thing aloud is sometimes the first step toward making it so. The morning brought practicalities, which was, Clara had long understood, what mornings were for. There were letters to be sent, to the Duke's mother, to Catherine's sister in Bath, to the family solicitors in London, to the various households of the peerage who would need to be informed through the proper channels. There were the specific and solemn tasks associated with preparing the Duchess's chambers, her wardrobe, her personal effects. There were the household staff to be steadied and directed and reminded that the work of the estate continued regardless of what the heart required. Clara did all of it. She moved through the house with the quiet, purposeful efficiency that had defined her work for a decade. And if the other members of the staff noticed that her eyes were red-rimmed and that she paused once in the corridor outside the Duchess's chambers with her hand pressed flat against the wall and her eyes closed for a full 30 seconds before she straightened and continued, they had the grace and the affection for her not to remark upon it. What everyone did remark upon, in the servants' hall, in the kitchen, in the careful whispered conversations that occur in large households whenever uncertainty about the future begins to take hold, was the question of what would happen to Clara now. It was not an uncharitable question. It was, in fact, the question most urgently relevant to Clara's own continued existence. A lady's maid without a lady was, in the domestic economy of 1843, a professional without a purpose, a situation that resolved itself, in most households, with a letter of reference and a bag packed within the month. The Duchess had been Clara's patroness, her employer in the most personal sense, the reason for her specific position in the Ashworth household. With Catherine gone, the logic of Clara's presence at the estate was, to a strictly practical mind, dissolved. The strictly practical mind in question was attached, unfortunately, to the Duke's mother. The Dowager Duchess Harriet Ashworth arrived at the estate 2 days after Catherine's death, traveling through the snow in a carriage that seemed to move with the same quality of implacable determination that characterized its passenger. She was 61 years old, still sharp-featured and formidably upright, a woman who had been raised in a tradition that considered emotional excess a form of social negligence, and had never once had cause to revise this view. She loved her son in the way that certain women of her generation loved their sons, completely possessively, and with an absolute conviction that she knew better than he did what was required for his happiness, and the continuation of the Ashworth line. She swept into the house, delivered a brief and correct expression of grief, and by the afternoon of her first day was already conducting what amounted to a quiet inventory of the household staff with an eye toward what changes the new circumstances would recommend. Clara became aware of this through the reliable intelligence network that exists in every large house. The information that passes between a kitchen maid carrying a tea tray and a footman stationed near a door. The soft accumulation of overheard fragments that resolves, eventually, into a clear and actionable picture. The picture was this. The dowager considered a lady's maid without a lady a redundancy. She had said as much to the Duke's secretary, a thin and nervous man named Bramley, who communicated information with the fidelity of a telegraph and the discretion of a town crier. Clara could expect her notice within the fortnight. Clara received this intelligence on the morning of a third day after Catherine's death, while she was in the linen room conducting an inventory of the household's formal table settings in preparation for the post-funeral gathering that would need to be organized. She stood for a moment with a silver serving fork in her hand, absorbing the information. Then she set the fork down, made a notation in the inventory ledger, and continued her count. She was not without resources. She had a decade of experience, an unimpeachable reference from Duchess, and the kind of practical intelligence that found employment readily in well-run households. She had her dignity, which she considered the most non-negotiable of her possessions. She would be all right. She had said so, after all. What she had not anticipated was the Duke. On the fourth day after Catherine's death, Edward Ashworth emerged from a study, where he had been conducting, by all available evidence, an extended and solitary campaign against the estate's most complex, outstanding correspondence, and summoned Clara to his presence with a brevity that suggested the interview would be short. Clara went with the composure she brought to everything, her hands folded before her, her expression neutral, prepared for the conversation she had been told to expect. The Duke was standing behind his desk when she entered. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept in 4 days, which was because he was a man who had not slept in 4 days. The lines of his face seemed deeper than she remembered. There was something in his eyes, not softness, exactly, because softness was not a quality she associated with the Duke of Ashworth, had never associated with him in 10 years of service, but something that might have been the negative space where softness had been removed. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment in silence. Clara had the distinct impression that he had prepared something to say and was now finding it inadequate, which was, in her experience, not a position the Duke of Ashworth often found himself in or responded to with any particular grace. "I am told," he said finally, "that you have managed the household arrangements for the past 4 days." "Yes, Your Grace." "The correspondence." "The preparations for the gathering." "The staff." "Yes." Another pause. He looked at the desk. He looked at some point above her left shoulder. He looked, briefly and with evident discomfort, directly at her. "My mother has suggested," he said, "that your position here would naturally conclude with—" He stopped. Something moved across his face, not emotion precisely, but the controlled suppression of it, which in a man like Edward Ashworth amounted to the same thing. "I do not agree with her assessment," he said. "I would like you to remain at Ashworth Hall as head housekeeper, if the position is acceptable to you. Mrs. Penworth will retain oversight of the kitchens. The household management in its entirety would fall under your direction." Clara looked at him steadily. She was aware, in some small and carefully guarded part of herself, that this was not what she had expected. She was aware also that she should not read anything into it beyond what it plainly was. An organizational decision made by a man who had just lost his household's most capable manager and needed the gap filled. She did not read anything into it. "The position is acceptable, Your Grace," she said. Thank you. He nodded. He looked back at his desk. The interview was apparently concluded. Clara turned to leave. Miss Voss. She turned back. The Duke was still looking at his desk. His jaw was set. His hands, she noticed, were clasped behind his back with the particular tension of a man holding himself very still. She spoke of you often, he said. My wife. A pause. She thought very highly of you. The carefully guarded part of Clara's chest tightened with a precision and a pain that she would not permit to show on her face. The feeling was mutual, Your Grace, she said. In every respect. She left the room. She walked down the corridor to the linen room where the silver inventory awaited completion. She sat down at the small table, opened the ledger, and picked up her pen. Her hand was not entirely steady. She waited until it was, and then she continued her work. Neither of them spoke of the deathbed promise. Not that day. Not for a long time after. But it was there, it had always been there, hanging between them in every room they occupied, in every formal exchange they conducted across the vast and managed distance of rank and roll, in every year that passed and every season that turned and every morning that arrived at Ashworth Hall with its requirements and its routines and its reliable, meticulous silence about the things that mattered most. It hung there like smoke. And everyone who has ever stood in a room with smoke knows that the longer you ignore it, the harder it becomes to breathe. There is a particular kind of man who builds his life around the principle of sufficiency, the conviction, held not as a philosophy, but as a bone-deep operating instruction, that what he has is enough, that what he feels is manageable, that the distance he maintains between himself and the warmer, more dangerous territories of human experience is not deprivation, but discipline. Edward Ashworth, 6th Duke of Ashworth, was this kind of man. He had been made into this kind of man with the systematic thoroughness that only a certain species of English aristocratic upbringing can achieve, and he had maintained the construction so long and so successfully that he had, by the age of 38, largely ceased to notice the effort it required. His father had been the template. The 5th Duke of Ashworth was a man of enormous presence and almost no warmth. A man who filled rooms the way certain weather fills rooms, with a pressure that rearranged everything around it without ever making direct contact with any of it. He had been distinguished, capable, and almost entirely absent from his son's interior life. He had communicated his expectations through intermediaries, tutors, housemasters, the carefully selected regiment of adults whose collective brief was to produce, from the raw material of a sensitive and observant boy, a duke. Not a man, precisely. A duke. The distinction mattered enormously and was never once articulated, because articulation would have required an acknowledgement that the two things were not the same. Edward had been a sensitive boy. This was the fact that all the subsequent architecture had been built to conceal. He had felt things, acutely, inconveniently, and with a depth that had terrified his father in the rare moments when it became visible, and that had been, accordingly, educated out of him with the patient consistency of a gardener trimming an unruly hedge. By the time he went to Eton, he had learned to present the smooth, composed exterior that the world required of him. By the time he came down from Oxford he had, through long practice, made the exterior and the interior largely continuous. By the time he married Catherine at 27, the sensitive boy was present only in the very deepest and most inaccessible rooms of himself, and he had lost, largely, the key. Catherine had not found the key, but she had, in 11 years, located the door. She had known, with the quiet, uncanny perceptiveness that had characterized her, that there was more to her husband than the composed and dutiful surface he presented to the world, and she had treated that knowledge with a gentleness and a patience that he had never explicitly acknowledged, but had relied upon more than he understood. She had not demanded entry. She had simply made the door feel less dangerous by standing near it without trying to open it, year after year, until her presence had become, without his noticing, the thing that made the entire interior architecture feel inhabitable. And now she was gone, and the interior architecture felt, once again, like a structure built for function rather than for living, efficient, well-maintained, and completely without warmth. He threw himself into work with the focused intensity of a man who understands, on some level below consciousness, that stillness is the enemy. Parliament consumed him from February through July. The debates, the committees, the relentless machinery of legislation that required his attention and rewarded it with the one thing he found genuinely manageable, which was the satisfaction of a problem correctly identified and a solution competently applied. He was good at Parliament. He was good at the particular register of engagement it required, intellectual, combative in the controlled and rule-governed way of formal debate, demanding of precision and resistant to sentimentality. He served on 3 committees. He delivered 2 speeches that were noted in the Times for their clarity and economy of argument. He was, by every external measure, functioning. The estate consumed the remainder of his attention. Ashworth Hall comprised 4,000 acres of farmland, woodland, and tenant holdings, and the management of it was, in normal times, a full-time occupation for the Duke's land agent and a supporting staff of 6. In the year following Catherine's death, it became something more. It became the Duke's principal occupation, the structure around which all other structures were arranged, the thing he reached for first in the morning and last at night. He rode the estate boundaries twice a week, regardless of weather. He met with his tenants personally, which was unusual for a man of his rank and noted with appreciation by the farming families who had, in previous generations, dealt exclusively with intermediaries. He reviewed the accounts with a thoroughness that made his secretary, Bramley, privately and reverently terrified. He found problems and solved them. He found inefficiencies and eliminated them. He found in the daily and specific work of stewardship a rhythm that resembled purpose closely enough to sustain him through the first year, and the second, and into the third. He did not grieve, or rather, he did not grieve in any way that was visible or that he would have recognized as grieving. He did not weep. He did not speak of Catherine to anyone. He did not sit in her rooms or handle her things or perform any of the rituals that the living use to maintain their connection to the dead. He had, with great efficiency, done what he always did with things he could not manage. He had filed them somewhere inaccessible and continued forward. What he did do, without acknowledging that he was doing it, was notice Clara Voss. Not in the way that a story like this, in its less honest versions, would have it. Not with the sudden, melodramatic recognition of a man struck by an arrow. Nothing so convenient or so legible. What he noticed was small and accumulative, the way one notices a change in whether not through any single observation, but through the slow aggregation of 100 small sensory data points that resolve, eventually, into knowledge. He noticed, for instance, that she ran the household with a quality of efficiency that was unlike anything he had observed in the previous management of the estate. It was not merely competent. It was, and he searched for the correct word with the precision he brought to all things, intelligent. She made decisions not from habit or precedent, but from a clear-eyed assessment of what was actually required. And the decisions were invariably correct. The household accounts, which had previously been handled by a man of business in Ashworth Village, were now maintained by Clara herself, in a ledger of such meticulous clarity that even the Duke, who was not easily impressed by organizational achievement, had paused when reviewing them and looked at them again, more slowly, with the expression he reserved for things that exceeded his expectations. He noticed that the staff respected her in a way that went beyond the ordinary deference owed to a superior, that the kitchen maids came to her with their small disasters, and that the footmen stood fractionally straighter when she was present, not from fear, but from something more like the desire to meet a standard that felt, coming from her, worth meeting. He had managed people his entire adult life. He understood the difference between compliance and genuine regard, and what the Ashworth staff felt for Clara Voss was unambiguously the latter. He noticed, and this was the observation he filed most quickly and most thoroughly, without examining it, that there were moments in their twice-weekly household reviews when she said something that surprised him. Not the content, necessarily, but the quality of it, the directness, the occasional dry precision, the evidence of a mind that was not performing deference, but simply reporting its conclusions in the register that the professional relationship required. He had grown so accustomed, in his dealings with the world, to people presenting him with what they thought he wished to hear, that the experience of receiving what someone actually thought was, quietly, almost imperceptibly, bracing. He did not think about any of this. He catalogued it in the way that careful, observant people catalog the things they are not yet ready to examine, in a place where it would be preserved until he was equipped to look at it directly, which he fully intended to be never. The deathbed promise remained unspoken between them. It was, in its way, the largest piece of furniture in every room they shared, the thing both of them moved around without acknowledging, the thing that made certain silences carry a weight that silences of their ordinary professional variety should not have carried. Clara never referenced it. The Duke never referenced it. The Duke's mother, who had remained a periodic and forceful presence at the estate, appeared to have either forgotten it or, which was more likely, decided that a deathbed promise made to a dying woman in a moment of emotional extremity had no binding power on a Duke of the realm and need not be dignified with discussion. The Duke was largely of the same view. He told himself this on a regular basis, which should perhaps have alerted him to something. In the summer of 1846, 3 years after Catherine's death, a man arrived at Ashworth Village that none of them could have anticipated. A man whose arrival would eventually, through a series of events as mundane as a burst pipe and as consequential as a redirected heart, begin the long and effortful process of dismantling the Duke's fortress from the inside out. His name was Edmund Hale. He was a solicitor from Bath, 32 years old, quietly spoken and carefully mannered, with a kind of reliable, undramatic good looks that inspire trust rather than passion, and the kind of steady, unhurried intelligence that builds things slowly and well and intends them to last. He had come to Ashworth Village to manage the estate of a recently deceased local landowner, a matter expected to occupy him for several months, and he had taken rooms above the village inn with the tranquil adaptability of a man comfortable in his own company. He met Clara Voss for the first time on a Tuesday morning in August, when she came into the village to collect a specific order of French milled soap that she procured monthly from a chemist, and that represented, as far as anyone could tell, one of the very few personal indulgences she permitted herself in an otherwise rigorously practical life. He was coming out of the solicitor's office across the street. She was coming out of a chemist. They very nearly collided on the narrow pavement, and he caught her parcel before it reached the ground, and she thanked him with the precise and pleasant courtesy she extended to everyone, and he smiled at her with the warm and uncomplicated openness of a man who had not yet learned to protect himself from the world, and did not see why he should. It was a nothing moment, the sort of moment that happens 100 times a day in a village, and leaves no trace, except that Edmund Hale watched her walk back toward Ashworth Hall for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and thought that he had never in his life seen anyone carry themselves quite like that, with that particular quality of self-possession, that unhurried certainty, as though she knew precisely where she was going and had decided, long ago, that the journey was worth the effort. And up in the hall, in his study, reviewing the quarterly accounts with the focused attention of a man who had made productive engagement with ledgers into a substitute for living, the Duke of Ashworth was entirely unaware that a clock had just begun to tick, quiet, precise, and utterly indifferent to the plans of dukes. The pipe burst on the 14th of January, 1847, at 2:30 in the morning, with a sound like a pistol shot echoing through the East Wing corridors. It was a kind of cold that January in rural England reserves for its most committed performances, the kind that does not merely lower the temperature, but seems to alter the fundamental nature of the air, making it brittle and hostile and faintly malicious, as though the atmosphere itself has taken the season personally. The Ashworth groundskeeping staff had wrapped the exposed pipework in the East Wing basement 3 weeks prior, following the Duke's standing instruction that preventative measures be taken before the deep freeze arrived. The wrapping had been competent. The freeze had been exceptional. And at 2:30 on the 14th of January, the preventative measures and the exceptional freeze met each other at a junction in the basement pipework behind the East Wing library, and the freeze won decisively. The water came through the library ceiling first, not as a dramatic cascade, but as a spreading darkness across the plaster, a slow and terrible bloom that a night footman named Peters discovered when he made his hourly round and noticed, with a horror entirely disproportionate to his 18 years of age, but entirely proportionate to the situation, that the ceiling above the Duke's most valued collection of first editions appeared to be quietly dissolving. Peters did what any sensible person would have done. He ran. He ran to the housekeeper's room, which was on the ground floor of the north wing, and he knocked with an urgency that communicated the substance of the emergency before he had said a single word. Clara Voss opened her door 45 seconds after the first knock, fully awake in the way that people who carry responsibility sleep. Lightly, with one part of the mind always attending to the possibility that something will require them. She was wearing a plain dark robe over her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that Peters, in his panic, did not notice, and that Clara herself was too immediately focused on the crisis to consider. She listened to Peters for 15 seconds, asked 2 precise questions, sent him to wake the senior footman and the head groundsman, and then she went, without pausing, to the Duke's chamber. She had never knocked on the Duke's chamber door. In 4 years as head housekeeper, she had communicated with him exclusively through the formal channels of household management, the twice-weekly reviews, the written reports, the carefully observed protocols of rank and role that structured every interaction between them. The door of his private chamber was, in a very real sense, a boundary she had never approached. She approached it now, because there was no time for protocols, and because the library contained, among its 3,000 volumes, a collection of first edition texts that the Duke valued beyond their considerable monetary worth. She knew this, because Catherine had told her, in one of those unguarded conversations that the closest domestic relationships produce, that the library was the one room in the hall where Edward Ashworth had ever appeared, even briefly, to be at peace. She knocked 3 times firmly. The silence on the other side lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then movement, quick, alert movement, the movement of a man who, whatever else might be said of him, did not require a long passage through confusion between sleep and waking. The door opened. The Duke of Ashworth was wearing a dark dressing gown over his nightshirt, his dark hair disordered in a way that Clara had never seen it and would not permit herself to particularly notice. He was fully alert. His eyes, she observed, went immediately from her face to the corridor behind her, assessing for the nature and scale of the emergency with the rapid efficiency of a man accustomed to command. "The East Wing Library, Your Grace," she said. "A pipe has burst in the basement. Water is coming through the ceiling. The first editions are at risk." She watched him absorb this in approximately 1 second. "How much water?" Peters described a spreading stain across the full width of the east ceiling. "I have not yet assessed it directly. I am going there now." "I am coming with you." It was not, she noted, a question. They went together through the night-quiet corridors of Ashworth Hall, the Duke with a lamp, Clara with a household emergency key ring that she kept on a hook beside her door and that contained, among its 30 keys, every lock in the East Wing. The distance from the Duke's chamber to the East Wing Library was not inconsiderable. They covered it quickly and in silence, the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable but purposeful. 2 people moving toward a shared problem with a shared understanding of its urgency, the professional relationship stripped by the extremity of the hour and the circumstance of its usual formal padding. The library was worse than Peters had conveyed. The ceiling stain had spread to cover perhaps a third of the room's width, and in the northeast corner, above the shelving that contained the most historically significant portion of the collection, water was no longer merely darkening the plaster, but actively dripping, a thin, steady percussion against the wooden floor that, in the silence of the deep night, sounded extraordinarily loud. The smell was already that particular cold dampness that presages structural damage. The smell of a building being slowly reminded of its vulnerability to the elements it was built to exclude. Clara went to the northeast corner first. She assessed the shelving with a rapid, practiced eye, the volumes closest to the drip, the trajectory of the spread, the rate of water ingress, the probable time before the drip became something worse. "The northeast shelving needs to come out entirely," she said. "Those volumes need to be moved to the south wall immediately. The water is tracking along the ceiling joist. You can see it there and there, which means it will reach the central shelving within the hour if the flow in the basement is not stopped." The Duke was beside her, following her assessment with his own, not deferring to it, she noted, but genuinely evaluating it, running his own eye along the trajectory she had indicated and arriving, apparently, at the same conclusions. Agreed, he said. Can the basement flow be isolated? There is a shut-off valve on the east wing main. Dawson will know where it is. He should be on his way. Then we moved the books. It was the most natural thing in the world, in that moment, for both of them to begin doing exactly that. There's something that happens in a shared physical crisis at 2 in the morning that does not happen in the ordinary managed exchanges of professional life. Something that the daylight hours and the formal structures of rank and role work very efficiently to prevent. The ordinary distances collapse. The careful maintenance of appropriate register becomes not abandoned, but temporarily irrelevant in the face of something that simply needs doing and needs doing now. Two people who have occupied the same house for 4 years as employer and employee, as duke and housekeeper, as the human embodiments of a social distance, so thoroughly naturalized that neither of them thinks about it consciously anymore. Those two people, at 2 in the morning with water dripping on irreplaceable books, become simply two people working. They worked for 4 hours. Dawson arrived and isolated the basement flow within 20 minutes, which slowed but did not immediately stop the water coming through the ceiling. The pipe had discharged a considerable volume into the wall cavity, which would continue to drain through for some time regardless. The northeast shelving was cleared and the volumes relocated to the south wall with a care that slowed the process, but that neither of them suggested abandoning. Each book handled properly, assessed for water damage, dried where necessary with cloths that Clara produced from the linen room 2 corridors away, catalogued in the margins of a household ledger that Clara appropriated for the purpose because there was no other paper immediately available and the Duke's objection to using a ledger. For non-accounting purposes lasted approximately 3 seconds before the practicality of the situation overcame it. The senior footman and 2 groundsmen managed the basement. Peters, redeemed by his quick action, and now running on the particular wild energy of a young man in the middle of an unexpected nocturnal adventure, fetched and carried with a willing inexhaustibility that Clara directed with quiet precision, and the Duke observed with something that might, in a less composed man, have been called amusement. At some point, Clara could not have said exactly when, the most acute phase of the crisis resolved into something more manageable, and the atmosphere in the library shifted fractionally from emergency to its aftermath. The dripping had slowed to an occasional drop. The rescued volumes were arranged in careful rows along the south wall. Dawson had reported from the basement that the damage to the pipework, while serious, was reparable and that a plumber from the village could be expected by 8 o'clock. The Duke was standing at the south wall, running his eye along the relocated volumes with an expression that Clara could not entirely read. Relief, she thought, but also something quieter, something less immediately legible. "The Caxton," he said. It was not quite a question. "Third shelf from the left, Your Grace." It was the first thing I moved. He looked at her then. Not the quick, assessing look of the professional exchange, not the directed glance of a man confirming information, but a look of a different and less easily categorized quality, the look of a man registering something he had not expected to register, as though he had reached for a familiar object in a familiar place and found, instead, something whose weight and texture surprised him. "How did you know which it was?" he said. Clara considered the question for a moment. "The Duchess told me," she said. "She told me a great many things about this house. She thought it important that someone who remained here should know them." The words landed in the room with a weight that neither of them had been prepared for. The mention of Catherine, specific, unguarded, attached to a purpose that reached across the years of her absence and proved itself, in this particular cold and waterlogged moment, to have been entirely correct, created one of those silences that are not empty but full, weighted with everything that is present in the room and not being said. The Duke looked back at the shelving. His jaw was set in the way she had come to recognize as the management of something he would not permit to surface. "She was thorough," he said. His voice was level, perfectly level. "She was extraordinary," Clara said quietly, "in ways that this house is still discovering." She did not look at him when she said it. She turned instead to the practical business of assessing what remained to be done before morning. The ceiling to be covered, the floor to be dried, the temporary arrangements for the displaced volumes to be formalized into something that would serve until the structural repair could be completed. But she was aware, with the peripheral precision that she brought to all things, that the Duke had turned to look at her again, and that he looked for a moment longer than was required by anything either of them had said, and that when he looked away, something in the set of his shoulders was fractionally different from how it had been at the beginning of the night, as though a single stone had shifted in a wall that had been built to be permanent, leaving a gap too small to be called an opening, but too present to be called nothing. She filed this observation in the same place she filed all observations of this variety, the place with no label and no key, the place she had maintained with great discipline since the night of the deathbed promise, the place she visited only in the small hours when she could not sleep, and the house was quiet, and the distance between what was and what could never be felt, briefly and dangerously negotiable. She did not negotiate it. She went back to work. But the stone had shifted. And stones, once shifted, have a tendency to take others with them, slowly, quietly, and with a patience that puts even the most carefully constructed fortresses at a disadvantage. The Dowager Duchess Harriet Ashworth arrived in April of 1847 with the specific energy of a woman who has identified a problem, developed a solution, and is prepared to implement it regardless of the opinions of anyone directly affected by the implementation. She came with 3 trunks, a lady's maid, a small and extraordinarily opinionated lapdog named Cornelius, and a list. The list was not written down anywhere that could be found and examined. It existed, instead, in the formidable organizational infrastructure of her mind. A catalog of names, lineages, dowries, and social positions, each entry representing a candidate for the position of the next Duchess of Ashworth, arranged in an order that reflected the Dowager's assessment of suitability with the same meticulous precision that Clara brought to the household accounts, and with considerably less mercy. The Duke was overdue for remarriage. This was the Dowager's position, and she held it with the immovable certainty of a woman who had never confused what she wanted with what was correct, because in her experience the two things were invariably the same. Edward was 39 years old. He had been a widower for 4 years. He had produced no heir. The Ashworth title and the 4,000 acres and the considerable fortune attached to both of them required continuity, and continuity required a son, and a son required a wife, and a wife required selection, and selection required her, because Edward had demonstrated, through 4 years of comprehensive inaction on this front, that he was not going to manage it himself. She installed herself in the West Wing guest suite, established Cornelius in a state of pampered comfort that was the envy of several junior footmen, and requested a private interview with her son on the morning of her second day. The Duke received her in his study with the composed and slightly braced expression of a man who loves his mother and finds her, at intervals, genuinely exhausting. She did not waste time on preamble. Preamble was, in her view, a resource consumed by people who were not confident of their position. "You will need to begin receiving again," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the authority of a woman who has never sat anywhere without immediately owning it. 4 years of withdrawal from society is mourning. 5 years is eccentricity. You are approaching the border. I have not withdrawn from society, mother. I have attended Parliament, the Alderton dinner, the parliamentary attendance, and one dinner do not constitute a social presence, Edward. They constitute the minimum required to prevent people from speculating about your health. She adjusted Cornelius, who had settled in her lap with the air of a creature who considers all human furniture his by right. I have written to Lady Ashford, to the Pembrokes, and to Sir Gerald Holt. I intend to organize a series of gatherings, informal, to begin with, that will allow you to reacquaint yourself with the social world and to meet several young women of excellent family and considerable personal merit. The Duke looked at her with the expression of a man calculating how many of his available options were actually available. "I see," he said. "I hope you do," she said pleasantly, "because I intend to proceed regardless, and it will be considerably more bearable for everyone if you choose to engage rather than endure." The gatherings began in May. There were 5 of them over the course of 6 weeks. each one carefully calibrated by the dowager to feel less like the matrimonial market exercise it was, and more like the ordinary social intercourse of people of quality, enjoying the English spring. There were luncheons and afternoon teas, and one larger dinner that required the full formal operation of Ashworth Hall's dining capacity, and consumed 3 days of Clara's organizational attention. There were croquet on the south lawn and musical evenings in the drawing room, and the particular species of apparently casual conversation that contains, beneath its pleasant surface, the entire apparatus of social assessment and strategic positioning. The candidates arrived with their mothers, their careful wardrobes, and their well-rehearsed accomplishments, and the Duke received them with a courtesy so impeccable and so thoroughly uninfected by any discernible personal interest that his mother, watching from across the room on the afternoon of the third gathering, briefly considered whether there might be something medically wrong with him. There was Lady Sophia Pembroke, who was 24 and genuinely lovely, and played the pianoforte with a skill that filled the drawing room beautifully, and left the Duke nodding with the polite appreciation of a man listening to something he respects, but does not feel. There was Miss Arabella Holt, Sir Gerald's eldest, 27 and sharp-witted and capable of holding a conversation about parliamentary reform that was, the Duke privately acknowledged, considerably better informed than most conversations he had on the subject with his actual colleagues. He liked her. He found her interesting. He experienced, in her company, no particular desire to be in her company again, which distinction he recognized, with a faint and unfamiliar discomfort, as meaningful. There was the Honorable Miss Charlotte Graves, who was 22 and very tall, and had the disconcerting habit of laughing at things approximately 3 seconds before anyone else understood they were funny, a quality the Duke found inexplicably grating. There was Mrs. Caroline Devereux, a widow of 31 with 2 young children and a practical, unsentimental approach to the prospect of a second marriage that he respected enormously and felt absolutely nothing about. There was Lady Frances Alderton, who was beautiful and kind and looked at him with an open, hopeful warmth that made him feel, with a sourness he could not entirely account for, like a man being offered something he had not ordered. He moved through each gathering with the focused discipline of a man who has been told there is something he is supposed to want and is making a genuine, systematic, and entirely unsuccessful effort to want it. Clara managed it all from the periphery. This was, in the technical sense, her professional role, to ensure that the household operated with seamless precision throughout the social season, that the food arrived at the correct temperature, that the flowers were arranged to the standard the occasion required, that the staff moved with the invisible efficiency that good domestic management produces, and that guests notice only in its absence. She was, in the execution of this role, superb. The gatherings ran with a smoothness that the dowager, who had high standards and expressed them freely, acknowledged in a brief and unembellished compliment to Clara on the morning after the third luncheon, the closest thing to effusive praise that the dowager's communicative style permitted. What was not her professional role? What was, in fact, entirely outside any brief she had been given or would have claimed, was the particular quality of attention with which she observed the gatherings from doorways and staircases and the far ends of corridors. She was not watching in the way of a servant monitoring the practical requirements of the event. She was watching in the way of a woman who has been trying for 4 years not to watch something, and who finds, when that something is presented with unusual directness and clarity, that the effort of not watching becomes temporarily beyond her. She watched Lady Sophia at the pianoforte and the Duke beside the window, and she noted the precise quality of his attention, present, correct, and absent in the way that presence can be absent when the animating principle is missing. She watched Miss Holt engage him in conversation on the lawn and saw the flicker of genuine interest in his expression, intellectual, appreciative, and self-contained in a way that she recognized, because it was the same quality of interest she had observed when he reviewed a particularly well-constructed argument in a parliamentary report. And it was not the same thing as what she had seen in his face in the library at 4 a.m, when he had looked at her over the relocated volumes. She noted this distinction with a part of her mind that was always, despite her best efforts, making these kinds of observations. She noted it, and she filed it, and she directed her attention back to the practical requirements of the moment, which were always, mercifully, available. But the filing was becoming, with each passing week less reliable. She had first become aware of the problem, because that was what she was now, quietly and privately, calling it, in February, approximately 3 weeks after the pipe incident. She had been conducting the weekly household review with the Duke in his study, presenting the maintenance schedule for the repaired east wing ceiling, when he had made an observation about the plastering contractor's proposed timeline that was, and this was the part she could not entirely account for, funny. Not obviously, not performatively. A dry, precisely targeted observation delivered in a tone so level that it took her a full second to understand that it was humor, and when she did understand it, she had looked up from the ledger and found him watching her with the expression of a man who was, almost imperceptibly, waiting to see if she had caught it. She had caught it. She had smiled, briefly, correctly, the professional smile of a housekeeper acknowledging her employer's wit. And he had looked back at the ledger with the focused neutrality of a man who had not just done something, and the review had continued. But she had thought about it afterward. That was the problem. She had thought about it with the specific, circling persistence of a mind returning to something it has not yet finished processing, and she had eventually, with the honest self-examination that was one of her less comfortable qualities, identified what it was that kept drawing her back. He had wanted her to catch it. The observation had been made for her specifically, calibrated to her specific register of intelligence and humor in a way that required him to know what that register was, which required him to have been paying attention, which opened a series of subsequent questions that she was absolutely not going to follow to their conclusions. She was not going to follow them because she was a housekeeper, and he was a duke, and there was a dead woman between them who had loved them both and whose final wish she refused to become the subject of. And because Edmund Hale had come into the village chemist on a Tuesday in March and returned her forgotten glove that she had left on the counter, and had done it with such simple, unpretentious kindness that she had thanked him with rather more warmth than the occasion technically required. Edmund Hale, it transpired, was still in Ashworth Village. The estate he had come to manage had proven, on examination, considerably more complex than initially anticipated. There were disputed holdings, contested portions of the will, matters that would require several more months of careful legal work to resolve. He had settled into village life with the tranquil adaptability she had noticed in him from the beginning. He attended the village church on Sundays. He was known at the inn for being a fair player at chess and a generous buyer of rounds. The village liked him with the unambiguous, uncomplicated warmth it reserved for people who made no pretension to be anything other than what they were. He had encountered Clara 3 more times since the glove incident, twice in the village on her weekly errands, once at the church at Easter, where they had exchanged a few minutes of pleasant conversation in the churchyard after the service with the easy, uncomplicated quality of people who find each other's company agreeable, without either of them yet knowing quite what to do with the fact. She found him genuinely good. Not brilliant, not complicated, not the kind of man whose dry observations required a second of processing before they resolved into humor. But good, steady and warm and honest in a way that she recognized as rare because she had spent 10 years in proximity to the alternative. And the alternative, for all its other qualities, had never once made her feel quite as straightforwardly at ease as Edmund Hale did on a Tuesday morning on a village pavement. She was thinking about this, with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of decision, on the afternoon of the 5th and final gathering, as she stood at the far end of the corridor outside the drawing room and watched through the half-open door as the Duke moved through the assembled guests with the perfect, hollow courtesy of a man going through motions he cannot bring himself to mean. He stopped, briefly, near the door. Not near enough to see her. Or, she thought, perhaps near enough, but choosing not to look. He picked up a cup of tea from a passing footman's tray. He took a sip. He set it down with the particular controlled deliberateness of a man steadying himself for a continuation he is not looking forward to. Then he turned back into the room, and Clara turned away from the door and went back to the practical requirements of the afternoon, which were extensive and pressing and entirely insufficient, today, to fill the space they were required to fill. Summer arrived at Ashworth Hall the way it always did, gradually, then all at once. The gardens moving from the cautious, tentative green of late spring into the full, unguarded abundance of June, as though they had been waiting for permission, and someone had finally granted it. The rose garden, which had been Catherine's particular project and which Clara had maintained with a fidelity that was equal parts professional duty and personal devotion, came into bloom in the second week of June with an extravagance that felt, to Clara, both beautiful and slightly reproachful. As though the garden was making a point about what survived and what did not, and what it cost to tend the things that the dead had loved. She cut roses on Thursday mornings. It was a task she could have delegated and never did. There was something in it, the early hour, the quiet, the specific and unhurried physical attention of selecting and cutting and arranging, that she found clarifying in a way she could not entirely articulate, but had long ago stopped needing to. She had her own thinking to do on Thursday mornings. The roses were where she did it. It was on a Thursday morning in the third week of June that the Duke found her there. He had been writing. She could tell from the state of his coat and the slightly heightened color of a man who has been out in the early air moving fast. And he had come around the south corner of the house on his way to the stables and simply encountered her, in the way that people encounter things when they have not been looking for them and find, when the encounter occurs, that the lack of preparation is itself informative. He stopped. She looked up from the roses. There was a moment of the particular quality that their moments had been developing, without her permission and without his acknowledgement, since January. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace." She returned to the roses, because the roses were an available task and available tasks were her primary defense against available moments. "You were out early. I could not sleep." She did not respond to this. It was not the kind of statement that the professional relationship invited her to respond to, and she was committed, this morning, to the professional relationship. He did not leave. This was becoming a pattern she had noticed and was choosing not to examine. The way he did not leave rooms when she was in them, the way his departure, which was always perfectly timed and socially unremarkable, had begun to be fractionally later than it used to be. She had measured this the way she measured everything, precisely, privately, and without any immediate intention to do anything with the measurement. "The marchpane rose," he said. He was looking at the bush she was currently working on, a pale pink variety of considerable antiquity that occupied the center of the east bed and that Clara had spent 2 seasons nursing back from the edge of what had appeared to be a terminal decline. "Yes," she said. "It's recovered well. My wife planted it the year we were married." A pause. "I thought it was finished after she died. I didn't think anything could be done with it." Clara looked at the rose for a moment. At the bloom she was holding, pale pink and perfectly formed, the result of 2 years of patient, unglamorous work. "Most things can be recovered," she said, "if you're willing to be patient and unglamorous about it." She had not intended that to mean anything beyond its horticultural content. She was relatively confident she had not intended it. She placed the rose in her basket and moved to the next plant. The Duke said nothing for a moment. Then, and she did not look up, but she heard it, he sat down on a low stone bench at the edge of the rose garden with the air of a man who has decided, this morning, not to be anywhere else in particular. This was new. She continued cutting roses. He sat on the bench. The June morning continued around them, birdsong and the distant sound of the stable yard coming to life, and the particular soft quality of early summer light that makes everything look as though it is being seen through a medium more forgiving than ordinary air. It was not, by any technical measure, a shared moment. They were simply 2 people occupying the same garden at the same time, engaged in entirely separate activities, exchanging no words that any reasonable observer would have found significant. And yet it was, unmistakably, something. The library came first, or rather, the library came first in the series of incidents that Clara was compiling, against her better judgment, in the part of her mind she had designated for observations she could not stop making. 3 days after the garden, she was in the library replacing a set of volumes that had been returned from the repair binder in the village, the water-damaged text from the January crisis, restored with considerable skill to something approaching their former condition. She was working quietly in the late afternoon when the Duke came in. He came in for a reason. She had no doubt of that, had no interest in constructing significance from things that had prosaic explanations. He came in because it was his library, and he used it with regularity. He selected a volume from the political philosophy section with the directness of a man who knows exactly what he came for. He sat at the reading table. He did not, however, read. Or rather, he opened the book and he looked at the pages, but Clara, replacing volumes 12 feet away and not watching, was somehow certain that the pages were not receiving his full attention. "The Caxton as well," he said, without looking up from the book that was not receiving his full attention. "Perfectly well, Your Grace. The binder did exceptional work on the water damage." "Good." A pause. "You chose him, I assume." "The binder." "I did. He came recommended by the Bodleian's Restoration Department. I wrote to them in February." Silence. Then, and she heard the quality of it, the fractional shift in register that she had been hearing more frequently and still had not found a way to categorize into something manageable. "You wrote to the Bodleian in February." The collection warranted it. Another silence. Longer this time. "Yes," he said. "It did." She finished replacing the volumes. She collected her cloth and her small bottle of conditioning oil and her list of tasks for the remainder of the afternoon. She turned toward the door. "Miss Voss." She stopped. She turned. He was looking at her now, the book closed on the table before him. His expression carrying that quality she had come to recognize and still could not name. The quality of a man looking at something he is not sure he is permitted to look at directly, conducting the looking anyway, and being fully aware of the contradiction. "The rose garden," he said. "The marchpane rose. Whatever you did with it, with the recovery, would you be willing to apply the same approach to the west bed? The climbing roses there have not been well." It was a perfectly reasonable household request. She received many such requests. She received them without complication and discharged them with efficiency, and that was the entire architecture of their professional relationship. "Of course," she said. "I'll assess it this week." She left the library. She walked to the linen room. She sat down at the small table and looked at the wall for approximately 45 seconds. Then she opened her household ledger and made a note about the climbing roses, and went on with her afternoon. Edmund Hale called on her brother that same evening. Her brother Thomas, who had, somewhat to everyone's surprise, not returned to Bremen as planned, but had instead found work at the Ashworth Mill and settled in the village with a practical contentment that Clara found both touching and, at moments like this, extremely convenient, had become, over the months of Edmund's residence in the village, a genuine friend to the solicitor. They played chess on Wednesday evenings. They had, apparently, the kind of easy masculine friendship that forms between men of similar temperament and different backgrounds and produces, among its side effects, an entirely natural and thoroughly unmanufactured reason for Edmund Hale to be in Clara's brother's kitchen on the evenings when Clara occasionally visited. She was there that evening. Thomas had asked her to supper, as he did every few weeks, a practice she valued because it gave her, for a few hours, somewhere to be that was not Ashworth Hall, where she did not have to be any particular professional version of herself, where she could sit in her brother's small bright kitchen and eat his somewhat approximate cooking and feel, briefly, the uncomplicated texture of a life that was simply her own. Edmund arrived at 7. He was genuinely pleased to see her. She had no doubt of that, had never had any doubt of it, because Edmund Hale was the kind of man whose interior and exterior were in complete agreement with each other, which was a quality she valued with an intensity that had only grown as she spent time in proximity to its opposite. They sat at Thomas's table and ate Thomas's approximation of a beef stew and talked for 2 hours with the easy, widening pleasure of a conversation between people who are discovering, incrementally, and with mutual appreciation, the extent of their compatibility. He asked about the house, not the Duke, not the social season, but the house itself, the history of it, the gardens, the things she had learned in 10 years of managing a place of such antiquity, because he had a genuine and non-strategic interest in the kinds of things that places accumulate over centuries. She asked about his work, the disputed estate, the legal complexities, the particular human dramas that will arise whenever inheritance and grief and family history are put in proximity to one another, because she found the law interesting in the way she found all well-organized systems interesting, as evidence of the human need to impose order on irreducible complexity. She walked home to Ashworth Hall at 9 o'clock under a sky full of stars. and she thought about Edmund Hale with the warm, uncomplicated pleasure of thinking about someone who has given you no cause for anything other than warmth and pleasure. She thought about the rose garden. She thought about the library. She thought about a dry observation made in February that had taken 1 second to resolve into humor. She recognized, with the honest self-examination that was both her greatest strength and her least comfortable companion, that these were not the same category of thought. The Edmund thoughts were warm and bright and sat quietly in her chest like a bank fire. Steady, reliable, pleasant. The other thoughts were something different. They did not sit quietly. They had an unsettled, restless quality, a tendency to move when she tried to hold them still, a resistance to the categories she attempted to place them in. She did not follow this recognition to its conclusion. She had been not following it to its conclusion for some months now, and she had become, she considered, fairly accomplished at the practice. She arrived at the hall, let herself in through the servant's entrance, and climbed the back stairs to her room. She changed and sat at the small writing table by her window, where she kept her personal correspondence and her household planning notes, and in the locked bottom drawer, the few things she kept that were entirely her own. She sat for a moment without writing anything. Outside, the summer night was warm and very still, and the rose garden was invisible in the darkness, but present in the mind the way that certain things are always present, not seen, but known, the way you know the position of something in a familiar room, even when the lights are out. The following Tuesday, she was coming out of the village chemist with her monthly order of French-milled soap, the small personal indulgence she had maintained since before Catherine's death, and would not relinquish on the grounds that a woman was entitled to at least one thing that was purely for herself. When Edmund Hale came out of the solicitor's office across the street and saw her and smiled with the open, uncomplicated pleasure of a man who is happy to see someone and has no particular interest in concealing the fact. They walked together for a little way, as far as the churchyard gate, where their paths naturally diverged. The conversation was easy and good, the way their conversations had become, and at the gate he paused and turned toward her with the expression of a man who has been building toward something and has decided that the building has gone on long enough. "Miss Voss," he said, "I wonder if I might, if you would consider, that is to say—" He stopped. He appeared briefly to take himself in hand. Then he looked at her with the direct, honest simplicity that was the most characteristic thing about him, and said, "Would you allow me to call on you? Formally, I mean. With your brother's permission, and with whatever intentions you think I ought to declare at this stage, which are entirely honorable, I assure you, and which I am happy to elaborate on at whatever length you consider appropriate." Clara looked at him, at his honest face, at the straightforward, unguarded hope in his expression that did not attempt to be anything other than what it was. She thought, briefly and entirely, without her permission, of the rose garden and the library and the dry observation in February. Then she thought of what she was and what she was not, and what was real and what was not, and what a woman in her position owed to herself, which was the truth about what was actually in front of her, as distinct from what was not. "Yes, Mr. Hale," she said. "I would like that." He smiled. It was a thoroughly uncomplicated smile, and it produced in her a warmth that was real and genuine in hers, and she held on to that as she walked back toward Ashworth Hall through the summer afternoon, past the estate gates and up the carriage drive and through the servants' entrance and up the back stairs, past the library door and the rose garden window, and all the way to her room, where she sat down and told herself, clearly and firmly, and with the full authority of a practical woman who has survived 10 years of proximity to the impossible by the rigorous application of common sense, that she had made exactly the right decision. She mostly believed it. Autumn came to Ashworth in the way it always did, with a kind of magnificent, unapologetic excess, the trees along the carriage drive turning from green to gold to copper to the deep, burning red that made the estate look, in the low afternoon light of October, less like a place people lived and worked and more like a painting of itself, something composed and lit and arranged for the specific purpose of being beautiful, before everything was stripped away. Clara noticed it every year. She had noticed it for 10 years. She noticed it this year with a heightened attention that she attributed, somewhat unconvincingly, to the particular quality of the light rather than to any alteration in her own interior weather, which had been, since the Tuesday afternoon at the churchyard gate, in a state of quiet but persistent turbulence that she was managing with her customary discipline and finding, somewhat to her frustration, that the discipline was not performing at its usual standard. Edmund called on her formally for the first time on a Saturday in August, arriving at the servants' entrance of Ashworth Hall with a propriety that she found both correct and, in some way she could not immediately name, touching the acknowledgment, implicit in the formality itself, that her position was something to be respected rather than navigated around. He brought no flowers, which she later learned was deliberate. He had asked Thomas what she liked, and Thomas, who knew his sister, had told him that she was not a woman who required gestures, but was a woman who noticed quality of attention, and Edmund had understood this immediately and acted accordingly. They walked. This became the structure of his calls, an hour on Saturday afternoons, walking the lanes around the village, talking with the ease that had characterized their conversations from the beginning. He was a good walker in the way that he was good at most things, steady, unhurried, attentive to the things the world offered along the way, without making a performance of the attention. He noticed the turning of the leaves in September with a genuine appreciation that made her trust him. He told her about his family in Somerset, a widowed mother, 2 younger sisters both well married, a comfortable, if not extravagant practice that he had built over 8 years from a single inherited client to something that represented, by his own modest assessment, a reasonable and reliable foundation for a life. She understood what he was telling her. She understood it with complete clarity and received it without misrepresentation, neither encouraging it beyond what she could honestly sustain nor diminishing it below what it genuinely was. He was building a case. He was building it carefully, honestly, and with evident sincerity, and the case, on its merits, was a good one. A life with Edmund Hale would be steady and warm and real, built on a foundation that she could see and assess and trust in a village or a town where she would be a woman with a name of her own rather than a function in someone else's household. She thought about this on the walks. She thought about it in the rose garden on Thursday mornings. She thought about it in the small hours when sleep was elusive and the hall was quiet and the locked bottom drawer of her writing table seemed, at those hours, to contain more weight than its physical contents warranted. She did not think, or attempted not to think, about the household reviews. The reviews had changed. This was the fact she was least equipped to manage and most committed to not acknowledging. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be identified and described to a third party with any confidence that the description would sound like anything more than a housekeeper conducting professional meetings with her employer. But the quality of them had shifted, incrementally, undeniably, in the direction of something that occupied a register adjacent to but distinct from the purely professional. He asked her questions now. Not household questions. Those had always been the mechanism of their exchanges, but questions of a different kind, the kind that required something beyond operational answers. He asked what she had thought of the parliamentary bill on agricultural tenancy that Bramley had left a summary of on his desk, not because her opinion was required, but, it seemed, because he wanted it. He asked about her brother, having learned from some source she never identified that Thomas worked at the mill. He asked, once, with the careful casualness of a man who has been constructing the approach to a question for some time and is determined to make it appear unconstructed, whether she had read anything recently that she had found interesting. She had looked at him across the household ledger for a moment before answering. "The Bronte novel," she said. "Jane Eyre." "I found it," she paused, selecting the word with precision, thought-provoking. He had looked at her. She had looked at him. The pause lasted approximately 2 seconds, longer than the pause between a question and its answer normally lasts. "In what respect?" he said. "In the respect," she said carefully, "that it proposes the interior life of a woman in service as a subject worthy of the same depth of treatment as any other, which is either a radical proposition or an obvious one, depending on who is reading." Another pause. Longer. "I would call it obvious," he said. His voice was entirely level. "I know," she said. And she looked back at the ledger, and the review continued. She told herself that this meant nothing. She had become very practiced at telling herself this. The argument began on a Wednesday afternoon in the first week of October over something entirely unremarkable, a disagreement about the timing of the annual accounts review, which Clara had scheduled for the second week of November, and which the Duke, for reasons connected to a parliamentary committee he had been asked to join, needed to move to the first week. It was a kind of scheduling conflict that arises in any large household, and it should have been resolved in 5 minutes with the practical flexibility that both of them generally brought to logistical problems. It was not resolved in 5 minutes. Clara had made commitments around the second week of November. She did not specify what they were, because they were personal and outside the scope of the professional relationship, and she was committed to that boundary with a firmness that had become, of late, somewhat load-bearing. The Duke asked, with the directness he brought to all things, what the conflicting commitment was. Clara said, with the equal directness she brought to all things, that the nature of the commitment was not relevant to the scheduling question, which could be resolved by either moving to the third week or dividing the review across 2 shorter sessions in the first week. The Duke said that neither option was satisfactory and that the nature of the commitment might, in fact, be relevant, since the accounts review was a household priority of considerable significance. Clara said, with a precision that had a temperature to it, that her time outside her professional hours was her own, and that she had not previously understood this to be a contested point. The Duke said that he was not contesting her personal time, merely asking a question. Clara said that the question was outside the scope of the professional relationship. The Duke said, and here was the moment, arrived at through the particular logic of an argument that had been about something else from the beginning, and had finally, through the accumulated pressure of what neither of them was saying, broken through to what it was actually about. I am aware, Miss Voss, that I have perhaps been unclear about the nature of my... He stopped. He stopped as though he had walked through a door and found, on the other side of it, a room he had not expected and was not prepared for. Clara looked at him. The silence was of the variety that does not feel empty. And then, into that silence, he said it. Not with calculation, not with intention. With the involuntary quality of something that has been held under pressure for too long, and has finally found the weakness in the container. I made a promise to my wife, he said. You know that I did. The temperature in the room changed. Clara went very still. The kind of still that is not the absence of movement, but the presence of something that has taken all available energy for itself and left none for peripheral functions. Yes, she said. Her voice was exactly level. I know. I have not. He stopped again. He looked at the desk with the expression of a man who has started something he does not know how to finish and is too honest to pretend otherwise. I have not handled it well, he said. The promise. What it meant. He looked up. His expression was, she had never seen his expression like this. Not composed. Not controlled. Something underneath the surface pressing upward against the architecture of containment that he had spent a lifetime constructing and maintaining. I think you should know that the promise was not nothing to me, he said. Even at the time. Even when I believed. Stop. Her voice was quiet. It was the quietness of something that has been compressed for a very long time and has found, finally, a form of expression so controlled that it contains more force than volume would have. Please stop. He stopped. I will not, she said, be a promise kept. Each word measured. Each one placed with the care of a woman who has thought about this, has thought about exactly this, in the locked bottom drawer of herself, in the small hours, in the rose garden, for 4 years. I will not be a debt, discharged. I will not be a dying woman's final gift to a man who has never once, in 10 years, looked at me as though I were a person rather than an obligation he is working up the courage to fulfill. The last sentence was not entirely fair. She knew that, even as she said it. But fairness was not, at this particular moment, entirely available to her. The Duke's face did something complicated. She did not wait to see what it resolved into. I have given 4 years to this house since the Duchess died, she said. I have given it everything I have. I have done it gladly, because this house was hers, and because the work is real, and because I am not, her voice, just for a fraction of a second, threatened to become something other than level, and she caught it and steadied it and continued, I am not a woman who does things by halves, whatever else I may be." She closed the household ledger on the desk between them with a care that was, in its very deliberateness, more expressive than any slam would have been. "I will give 1 month's notice. I can have a full transition document prepared for my replacement within a fortnight. The accounts review," and here improbably she almost smiled, though it did not reach her eyes, "can be scheduled for whatever week you find convenient." She left the room. She walked down the corridor with the straight-backed, unhurried precision of a woman who absolutely will not, allow the quality of her exit to be diminished by the magnitude of what she has just done. She went to her room. She sat at the writing table. She did not open the locked bottom drawer. She took out a clean sheet of paper. She wrote the date at the top. She began her letter of notice with the formal salutation that the professional relationship required. She got as far as the second sentence before she set the pen down and pressed her hands flat on the table and closed her eyes and stayed very still for a long time, in the way that she had learned, over 10 years, over a lifetime, over all the mornings she had gotten up and done what needed doing regardless of what the night before had cost her, to simply be in the difficult moment until the difficult moment passed. Downstairs in his study, the Duke of Ashworth sat at his desk and looked at the household ledger she had left behind and understood, with the particular, terrible clarity of a man who has just watched himself do the wrong thing and cannot undo it, that something had broken. Not the professional arrangement, not the formal structure of employer and employee, housekeeper and duke. Something less replaceable than that. He sat with this understanding for a long time. Then Bramley knocked and entered with the afternoon's correspondence, and the Duke straightened and set his expression to its customary register and dealt with his letters with his customary efficiency, and nothing in his appearance or his behavior gave any indication of the interior damage. He was, after all, very well practiced at that. 3 days later, he received the news from Bramley, who had heard it from Peters, who had heard it in the village with the speed that villages disperse information about things that matter to the people who live there. Miss Clara Voss, it was reported, had accepted the formal courtship of Mr. Edmund Hale, the solicitor from Bath currently resident in Ashworth Village. The Duke received this information on a Thursday morning. He dismissed Bramley. He went to the window of his study, the window that looked out over the carriage drive and beyond it the east gardens, and at the far corner, just visible from this angle if one stood at the right position, the edge of the rose garden. He stood there for a long time. The marchpane rose was past its season now. The blooms were gone. The canes remained bare thorned, already preparing in their invisible interior way for whatever came next. He looked at it for a long time. Then he sat back down at his desk and picked up his pen, and tried, with the focused and completely unsuccessful application of a man attempting to use discipline to fill a space that discipline was never designed to fill, to continue with his morning. He could not sleep that night. He could not sleep the night after that. On the third night, at 2 a.m, in the same chair at the same desk in the study, where Catherine had first brought Clara to his attention 12 years ago in a way he had not understood and was only now, God help him, only now, beginning to fully, finally, and at the worst possible moment understand, he put his head in his hands, and he stayed that way for a very long time. And in the silence of the hall around him, the clocks ticked on, precise, patient, and entirely without pity. He did not go immediately. This was important. Not as a failure of courage, though he would later judge it as one, but as evidence of the particular species of internal combat that occurs in a man who has spent the better part of 4 decades building a relationship with himself based on the premise that what he wants is less important than what is correct, and who finds, at 39, that the premise has collapsed and the rubble is everywhere, and he does not yet know how to move through it. He spent the first day, after learning of Edmund Hale's courtship, doing what he always did when the interior landscape became unmanageable. He worked. He rode the estate in the morning with a focus so concentrated that his land agent, riding alongside him for the scheduled boundary inspection, noted afterward to his wife that the Duke had seemed, that particular Thursday, like a man who was looking at the fields and seeing something else entirely, which was not an observation the land agent would normally have made about the Duke of Ashworth, who was, in his professional experience, a man almost pathologically present to whatever was in front. of him. He spent the afternoon in Parliament. He delivered, by all accounts, a precise and well-argued contribution to a debate on railway expansion that was noted in the following day's Times as among the more substantive of the session. He received this intelligence from Bramley with the detachment of a man receiving information about someone else's performance. He spent the evening in his study with the estate accounts, which did not need his attention but received it anyway, because the alternative was sitting in a room without the estate accounts, and he was not yet equipped for that. He did not eat dinner. Mrs. Penworth sent a tray. It was returned untouched, which produced in the kitchen a quality of concerned silence that communicated itself throughout the servants' hall with the efficiency of long practice. Clara, who had her notice letter on her writing table awaiting final review before submission, ate her own dinner in her room that evening with the determined practicality of a woman who understands that bodies require fuel regardless of the condition of the heart, and who is committed to the maintenance of both with equal rigor. She had told Thomas about her decision to leave Ashworth Hall. He had listened with the careful attention of a brother who has opinions and knows when not to give them. He had asked once whether she was certain. She had said yes with a conviction that was perhaps 1 degree more emphatic than certainty requires. She had not yet told Edmund. This was the thing she was sitting with in the evenings, the specific and uncomfortable shape of what she owed him, which was honesty about the fact that her decision to leave the hall was not exclusively motivated by the professional reasons she was capable of articulating, and honesty about that fact felt, at present, like a door she needed to open but had not yet found the precise words for. Edmund had called on Saturday as usual. He had been warm and good and entirely himself, and she had been warm and good and 3/4 herself. And if he had noticed a fraction that was elsewhere, he had not remarked upon it, which was either tact or trust, and she was not entirely sure which, and the uncertainty itself told her something she was not yet ready to hear. The Duke spent the second day, much as he had spent the first, with the variation that he did not go to Parliament and instead remained at the estate, covering ground he had already covered, finding tasks that were already done, and conducting a comprehensive internal argument with himself that moved through several distinct phases. The first phase was the phase of rational objection, in which he enumerated, with the systematic thoroughness he brought to all analysis, the reasons why what he was considering was not possible. She was his housekeeper. She was a woman of no rank. Society would not simply whisper, it would roar. His mother would. He did not complete this thought, not because he was deterred by it, but because the list of his mother's likely responses was extensive, and he did not have the energy for its full inventory. He had a duty to his name, to the estate, to the line of succession that required a marriage of appropriate standing, and had required it. His mother would point out, for 4 years already. The second phase was the phase in which he recognized that the rational objections were all about rank and society and duty, and that not one of them was about whether what he felt was real, which was the only question that was, in the end, actually on the table. The third phase was the phase in which he stopped arguing. He stopped arguing on the second night at approximately 11 o'clock while sitting in the library, his library, the room where the Caxton sat restored on its shelf, the room where she had stood 12 feet away replacing volumes in the late afternoon light while he pretended to read. And he acknowledged, with the totality of a man who has finally cornered himself in the only room left in the building, the full and unambiguous truth of what he felt. He loved her, not as an obligation, not as the residue of a promise, not as gratitude or proximity or the particular vulnerability of grief seeking comfort. He loved her with the specific, irreducible particularity that real love has, the love that is not for a category of person, but for this person, for the quality of her attention and the precision of her mind and the dry, perfectly calibrated humor that took 1 second to resolve, for the way she had pressed her hand flat against the wall outside Catherine's room in the weeks after the death, and allowed herself 30 seconds of grief before straightening and continuing, for the 2 years of unglamorous patient work she had given to a rose that everyone else had written off, for the way she had looked at him across the household ledger, and said I know with a completeness that had made the two words carry everything neither of them had said, and everything both of them had felt, and the entire vast, weighted, unacknowledged distance between what they were and what they might have been. He had loved her for longer than he could now cleanly trace. It had arrived the way the most significant things arrive, not as an event, but as a condition, not noticed until it had been present long enough to be undeniable, and by then already constitutive, already woven into the interior architecture of him in ways that could not be removed without removing something essential. He sat with this recognition for a long time. He did not perform it or dramatize it or allow it to become anything other than what it was, a fact arrived at finally, at significant cost, and entirely too late. Then he thought about Edmund Hale. He thought about Edmund Hale with the scrupulous fairness of a man who was trying very hard not to think about him only as an obstacle, because she had chosen Edmund Hale, or was in the process of choosing him. And she had done so as a free woman exercising her own judgment, and her judgment was, he knew with certainty, excellent. Edmund Hale was, by all evidence, a good man. Honest, steady, capable of the kind of uncomplicated warmth that she deserved, and that he himself had spent 10 years failing to offer her. He had no right to interfere with that. He understood this clearly. He also understood, with equal clarity, that he was going to. Not to take from her a choice she had made. Not to claim her as though she were a thing to be claimed, she had told him, with a precision she brought to everything, that she would not be a promise kept. And he had heard her, and he would not insult her by arriving at her door with an obligation dressed up as a feeling. But because she deserved to know, completely honestly, and without the armor of rank or restraint, what he actually felt. What he had felt for longer than he had admitted to himself. Because if she was going to choose Edmund Hale, and she was entirely entitled to choose Edmund Hale, she should choose him in full possession of the truth rather than in the partial knowledge that his 10 years of proud, self-protective silence had left her with. He owed her the truth. He had owed it to her for longer than he could now comfortably contemplate. He rode to the village on the third morning. He did not send word ahead. This was a decision he made deliberately, not from a desire to surprise her or to deny her the preparation that courtesy would normally require, but because he understood, with the self-knowledge of a man who has spent 3 sleepless nights acquiring it, that if he sent word ahead, he would spend the intervening hours composing himself back into the armored register of the Duke of Ashworth, and what he needed, this morning, was to arrive as someone else, as whatever was underneath. Thomas Voss opened the door of his small cottage on the eastern edge of the village and looked at the Duke of Ashworth on his doorstep with the expression of a man who is genuinely surprised, but is constitutionally inclined to take surprising things in stride. He was Clara's brother in the way that was immediately apparent. The same gray eyes, the same quality of steady, assessing attention. Though where Clara's assessment was precise and contained, Thomas's had the slightly broader, more generous quality of a man whose natural orientation to the world is curiosity rather than analysis. "Your Grace," Thomas said. "Mr. Voss." The Duke paused. He had not, he realized, planned precisely what came next. This was unusual. He was a man who planned. "I am looking for your sister," he said. Thomas looked at him for a moment with those gray eyes that saw considerably more than most people's gray eyes saw, and the Duke had the sudden, uncomfortably acute sense that the man in the doorway understood everything about this visit that needed to be understood, and had formed his opinion of it in approximately the time it had taken him to open the door. "She's in the back garden," Thomas said. He stepped back to let him through. The back garden of Thomas Voss's cottage was small and practical and well tended, the garden of a man who grew things for use rather than ornament, though there was, in the far corner, a climbing rose of indeterminate variety that was either a concession to beauty or a gift from his sister. The Duke suspected the latter. Clara was at the far end of the garden near the vegetable beds, crouching to examine something in the soil with the focused attention she brought to all growing things. Her dark coat a sharp contrast against the pale October light. She heard him. He saw the moment she heard him, the slight stilling of her hands, the fractional change in the quality of her stillness, the breath she took before she stood and turned. She looked at him. Her expression was composed. The composure she had worn like armor for 4 years. The composure he now understood had been costing her something, and had respected too little and admired too much. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was entirely level. He crossed the garden toward her with the directness of a man who has run out of the capacity for indirection. He stopped at a distance that was respectful, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough that she was not pressed, because he was not here to press her. He was here to tell her the truth, and then to let her do with it what she chose. "Clara," he said. He had never called her that. Not in 10 years. Not once. The composure flickered. Just for a moment. Barely visible, barely there. And then it steadied again, but not entirely. And the not entirely was what gave him the courage to continue. "I am not here to revive the promise," he said. "I am here because you told me that I had never looked at you as though you were a person rather than an obligation, and because that is," he stopped. He had prepared for this moment with the precise, careful preparation he brought to all things that mattered. And he found now that the preparation was insufficient, because the prepared words were too composed, and what was required was the opposite of composed. "That is not true," he said. "It has not been true for longer than I know how to account for with any honesty about the timeline." She said nothing. She was watching him with the gray eyes that saw everything. "I have been a coward," he said. "Not in the way that produces dramatic failure. I would almost have preferred that. It would have been easier to identify and address. A quiet coward. The kind who uses propriety and rank and the fact that the thing he wants seems impossible as reasons not to want it, and calls it discipline." He paused. "It was not discipline. It was fear. And I have enough respect for you. And I should have shown that respect considerably earlier and with considerably more consistency, to say that plainly." The garden was very quiet. A bird somewhere in Thomas's climbing rose. The distant sound of the mill. "Edmund Hale is a good man," the Duke said. It cost him something to say it. He said it anyway. "I am not here to speak against him. I am not here to tell you that what he offers you is not real or not worthy. It is both, and you deserve both. And if you choose him, I will not." A pause, brief, controlled. "I will not diminish that choice by making it more difficult than it needs to be." He looked at her directly. "But I am here to tell you that I love you," he said. "Not because Catherine asked me to. Not because you have served this house faithfully, and I am confusing gratitude for something else. Not because you are available and convenient, and I have grown accustomed to your presence. Because you are," he stopped, and for one moment, one brief and entirely unprecedented moment, the 6th Duke of Ashworth appeared to be searching for words, which was something the 6th Duke of Ashworth did not do. "You are the most extraordinary person I have known in my adult life, and I have spent 10 years standing 6 feet away from that fact and refusing to look at it directly, and I cannot." He stopped. He looked at her. "I cannot continue to do that," he said. "Not now that I understand what it has cost. Both of us." The silence that followed was the longest silence Clara Voss had ever stood inside. She looked at him, at his face, which was open in a way she had never seen it open, stripped of the architecture that had defined it for as long as she had known him, every careful construction of rank and composure and self-protective distance temporarily absent, leaving behind something she had not known was there. She thought of Edmund, of his honest face at the churchyard gate, of the Saturday walks, of what he had offered her with such simple, uncomplicated generosity. She thought of Thursday mornings in the rose garden and a library at 4 in the morning and a dry observation in February that had taken 1 second to understand. She thought of 10 years. "I need you to leave," she said. Her voice was not entirely level this time. "Clara, please." The word was quiet and firm and cost her something visible. And he saw it cost her, and he honored it. "I will," he said. "But I need you to know, whatever you decide, that this was real. That I am standing here without the promise and without the rank and without anything except the truth. And the truth is that I love you. And you deserve to hear it said plainly, without condition, a very long time ago." He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned and crossed the garden and walked back through Thomas's cottage and out to the lane where his horse was waiting. and he rode back toward Ashworth Hall through the October morning with the particular hollowed steadiness of a man who has done the only thing he could do, and does not yet know if it was enough. Behind him, in the small back garden, Clara stood among the vegetable beds for a long time. Her hands at her sides were not entirely steady. She did not move to steady them. For once, for just this once, she let them be. The village of Ashworth had, like all villages of its size and disposition, a comprehensive and largely accurate intelligence network that operated through the medium of ordinary life. The butcher's counter, the churchyard gate, the inn's common room on a Wednesday evening, the particular acoustic properties of the chemist's shop, which was narrow and had low ceilings and conducted sound with a fidelity that its proprietor, a discreet man named Gibbs, had long ago accepted as an unalterable feature of his professional environment. By Thursday evening, it was known in the village that the Duke of Ashworth had ridden to Thomas Voss's cottage on Wednesday morning and had been inside for a sufficient duration to rule out a purely administrative call. By Friday morning, it was known that Miss Clara Voss had been seen walking alone on the Eastern Lane on Wednesday afternoon with the particular quality of purposeful solitude that people adopt when they are thinking about something too large and too private for company. By Saturday, when Edmund Hale arrived at the cottage for his customary call and stayed for considerably less than his customary hour, the village had assembled these data points into a narrative that was, in its broad outline, correct, and was discussing it with the earnest, invested attention that small communities bring to the stories of people they have watched long enough to care about. Edmund had known before the Duke came. Not specifically. He had not known that the Duke would ride to the cottage on a Wednesday morning with his face open and his armor gone. But he had known, in the way that honest and perceptive men know things they would prefer not to know, that something in Clara's interior landscape had a geography he had not mapped and could not entirely account for. He had known it since the Saturday after the argument, when she had walked beside him with her customary warmth and her usual quality of attention, and something behind her eyes that was somewhere else. And he had understood, not with resentment, not with self-pity, but with a clear-eyed honesty that was the most fundamental thing about him, that the somewhere else had a specific address. He had hoped he was wrong. He was a human being, and he had hoped he was wrong with the full ordinary force of a man who has found something rare and does not want to lose it. He was not wrong. He sat with Clara in Thomas's small front room on the Saturday after the Duke's visit, and she told him, with the directness and the care that he had come to know as the most characteristic expression of her respect, what had happened, and what she felt, and what she did not yet know, and what she owed him, which was the truth, and which she was giving him now. She did not dress it in gentler language than it warranted. She did not diminish what they had built together in order to justify what she was telling him. She held both things, what he was to her, and what she had discovered she could not resolve, with an honesty so complete and so evidently painful that Edmund Hale, who was a good man in the specific and non-trivial sense of the word, found that his predominant feeling, sitting across from her in Thomas's small front room, was not anger. It was something closer to sorrow. And beneath the sorrow, something that he would not have predicted, and that moved him, briefly, more than the sorrow did, a kind of recognition. He had seen the Duke of Ashworth once from a distance at the village church at Easter, and he had thought, with the involuntary, unguarded perception of a man who reads people accurately and without artifice, that there was a man carrying something heavy that he did not know how to put down. He understood now what the weight had been. "I am not releasing you from obligation," he said quietly, when she had finished. "You have made me no promises. You owe me nothing in the formal sense." He paused. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "But I want to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it as honestly as you have answered everything else." "Yes," she said. "If he had never come to that cottage," Edmund said, "if he had said nothing, done nothing, remained behind the walls of his estate and his rank and his silence, would you have been happy with me?" The question sat in the room with the weight of genuine inquiry. Clara looked at him. She thought about Saturday walks and honest faces and the warm, uncomplicated pleasure of a man who had never once required her to be anything other than what she was. "I would have been genuinely happy," she said. And she meant it. Every word of it was true. Edmund nodded slowly. "Then the question," he said, is not whether I am good enough. The question is whether what you feel for him is something you can live without." He looked at her with the steady, undefended gaze of a man who already knows the answer, but needs her to find it for herself. "And I think, Clara, I think you and I both know the answer to that." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright in the way that they had not been in all their Saturday walks, and all their easy conversations, and all their good and genuine hours together. The brightness of something real and specific and irreducible. The brightness of a thing that has been held down for a long time and has finally, in the honest light of this small room, been permitted to surface. "Edmund," she said. Her voice was soft. "I am so sorry." "Don't be," he said. And he meant that too. Be honest. Be certain. And then he paused and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family. The expression of a fundamentally decent man making peace with something that cost him. And then go and be happy. Properly. Without reservation. He stood. He was, Clara thought, in that moment, one of the finest people she had ever known. "I think you've earned it." He left with the dignified simplicity of a man who does not make exits dramatic, because he has never seen the point of drama when honesty will serve. Thomas, who had been in the kitchen with the elaborate unobtrusiveness of a brother who is absolutely listening through the wall, came in afterward and sat across from his sister and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Well." Clara looked at him. "Don't look at me like that," Thomas said. "I've known since January. Since you came home from that pipe business at 2 in the morning and made tea and didn't drink it and stared at the wall for 20 minutes before you realized I was sitting across from you." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "Was I that obvious?" "Only to me," Thomas said. "And possibly to the Duke, though he appears to have needed considerably longer to arrive at the same conclusion." He paused. "He loves you, Clara. I saw his face when I opened the door. That is not a complicated man attempting a complicated thing. That is a man who is terrified and doing it anyway. He is the Duke of Ashworth," Clara said. The words were not a protest, precisely. They were more like the statement of a fact she was still in the process of integrating. "He is," Thomas agreed. "He is also, apparently, a man who has been sitting 6 feet away from the most important thing in his life for 10 years and has finally, at significant personal cost to his dignity, decided to do something about it." He looked at his sister with the gray eyes they shared. "The question is not what he is, Clara. The question is what you are going to do." What she was going to do required 3 days to determine. She spent the first day at Ashworth Hall, moving through her duties with a discipline that had never yet failed her, and that was, today, operating at approximately 70% of its customary efficiency, which was still considerably better than most people's 100%, but which she noticed and found unsatisfactory. She passed the library twice. She did not go in. She passed the study door once. She heard nothing from behind it and walked on. She spent the second day in the rose garden on Thursday morning, cutting the last of the autumn blooms with a slowness that was not her usual efficiency, but something else, a deliberateness, a quality of choosing to be in this specific place with this specific history, running her hands over the canes of the marchpane rose that had been dead and was not, that had required 2 years of unglamorous patience and had rewarded it, that had been Catherine's and was now, in some quiet and complicated way, both of theirs. She thought about Catherine. She had thought about Catherine throughout all of this, not with guilt, because she was too honest for guilt that was not warranted, but with the complex, layered regard of a woman thinking about someone who had loved her and known her and seen, perhaps, something that Clara herself had been the last to see. She thought about the deathbed chamber and the candlelight and the voice that had spent its last reserves on a request that had seemed, at the time, like generosity toward Clara, and had turned out to be. She understood this now, in the rose garden, with the October light thin and clear around her. Something more precise than generosity. Something more like knowledge. Catherine had known. She had known her husband with the complete and unsentimental accuracy of 11 years of faithful attention, and she had known Clara, and she had looked at both of them and seen what neither of them could yet see in themselves, and she had spent her last coherent moments trying, gently, indirectly, in the only way available to her, to make it possible. Clara stood in the rose garden for a long time. Then she went inside and wrote 2 letters. The first letter was to Bramley, the Duke's secretary, informing him that she was withdrawing her notice of resignation and would be continuing in her position as head housekeeper of Ashworth Hall. She asked him to communicate this to the Duke at his earliest convenience. She kept the letter brief and formal and gave no explanation beyond the professional, because the professional was all that Bramley needed and all that she was prepared to provide through an intermediary. The second letter she delivered herself. She knocked on the study door at 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. She heard him say come in with a voice that she had known for 10 years and that had, at some point she could not precisely identify, become a voice she could not imagine the hall without. She opened the door. He was at his desk. He looked up. His expression when he saw her, before he composed it, in the half-second before the habitual architecture of control engaged, was the expression she had seen in Thomas's garden. Open, undefended, something underneath the surface, present and unguarded and entirely real. She closed the door behind her. She crossed to the desk. She did not sit. She placed the second letter on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. I am withdrawing my notice, she said. Bramley will have the letter. He said nothing. I want to be clear about something, she said. She held his gaze with the directness that was the most consistent thing about her, the quality that had defined her since the first day she had stood in this house as a girl of 16 and had looked at the world it contained and decided, quietly and without announcement, that she would not be diminished by it. I am not staying because of what you said in Thomas's garden. I am not staying because of the promise or because of the Duchess or because of 10 years of proximity, creating the illusion of something it is not. She paused. I am staying because what you said was true. I know it was true because I have known it. In the part of myself I do not generally permit to have opinions for longer than I am entirely comfortable admitting. The Duke of Ashworth, who had conducted parliamentary debates and managed 4,000 acres and navigated every social and professional complexity his rank had thrown at him for 20 years, appeared, in this moment, to be experiencing some difficulty with speech. Clara, he said. I have conditions, she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the precursor to one, the landscape of a face preparing to do something it had not done in a very long time. I would expect nothing less, he said. I will not be managed, she said. I will not be arranged or presented or fitted into the requirements of your rank, as though I am a problem to be solved. If you intend to, if this is, she stopped. She had the unusual experience of finding that her own words were not entirely at her disposal. She recovered them. If you are serious, she said, then you are serious regardless of what society says, regardless of your mother, regardless of the whisper mills of London and the opinion of every drawing room in the county. I will not begin something that ends the moment it becomes inconvenient. It will not end, he said. I am constitutionally incapable of doing things by halves. You know that. I do, she said. It is one of the less comfortable things about you. This time the smile came, brief, unguarded, entirely unlike the composed and managed expressions she had catalogued over 10 years, and so much more itself that it was almost difficult to look at directly. I have a condition also, he said. She waited. Stop filing things in the place with no label, he said quietly. Whatever you have put away in there that belongs to this, to us, I would like you to stop filing it away. I would like you to let it be present. He paused. I have been the architect of the distance between us. I know that. I intend to spend a considerable amount of time dismantling it, if you will allow me. The study was very quiet. Outside, the October light was failing over the estate, the long shadows of the carriage drive trees stretching across the gravel, the rose garden invisible from this window but present, as it always was in the mind. You may begin, Clara said, by not calling me Miss Voss in the household reviews. He looked at her. Clara, he said. Just that. Her name, in his voice, without the rank before it or the professional distance after it. Just her name, in the room where it had never been said that way before. Yes, she said. That will do. What came after was not simple. She had never expected it to be simple, and she was, in this as in all things, correct. The dowager arrived within the fortnight. The interview she requested with her son lasted 3 hours, and whatever was said within it was known only to the two of them, though Bramley reported afterward that the Duke had emerged from it with the expression of a man who has withstood a significant siege and is still standing, which was, by the standards of the dowager's opposition, a decisive victory. The whispers in London began within the month. A Duke pursuing a housekeeper. It was, by the measure of 1847 London society, a scandal of a quality that fell just short of the most spectacular category, but well within the range that required active management. And the management it received from the Duke was the management of a man who had decided, with the completeness and the finality of a decision made after a very long time of deciding nothing, that he was not interested in managing it at all. He simply continued. He continued with the steadiness that was, when directed toward something real rather than toward its suppression, the most formidable thing about him. And Clara, watching him weather it, watching him stand in the path of every social wind his choice produced without flinching, without qualification, without the smallest retreat into the easier alternative that was always available to a man of his rank and would cost him nothing except her, felt something shift in the very deepest and most inaccessible room of herself. The door that had been built to be permanent. She found, one evening in November, that she had the key. The morning of the 23rd of November, 1853, arrived at Ashworth with a frost so fine and so complete that it covered every surface of the estate with an even, crystalline precision that made the grounds look, in the early light, like something that had been finished rather than merely grown. The lawns and the gravel and the bare branches of the carriage drive oaks all rendered in the same silver white, as though the night had taken the estate and made a study of it in a single careful medium. Clara stood at the window of the room that had been prepared for her in the east wing, not her housekeeper's room, which she had occupied for 6 years and which had been quietly, without ceremony, reassigned to Mrs. Hartley, who had come up from the village in the spring to take on the household management role, and looked out at the frost-covered grounds with the particular quality of attention she brought to things she wanted to remember. She was 36 years old. She was wearing a dress of deep blue wool that Thomas had declared, with the unembarrassed directness of a brother who has strong opinions about his sister's appearance and is not shy about expressing them, to be the precise color that suited her best, and that she had chosen for this day with the care she brought to all things that mattered, which was the care of someone who understands that the details of a significant moment are themselves significant, not because they will be seen by the world, but because they will be held in the memory, and memory, she had learned, is not indifferent to texture. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," she said. Thomas came in. He was wearing his good coat, the one he had purchased for the occasion, with a solemnity that she had found both touching and slightly amusing, because Thomas, in his good coat, had the air of a man who has decided to take himself seriously for the day, and is finding it requires more effort than anticipated. He carried 2 cups of tea, which he had brought from wherever tea was being produced this morning, and which he set on the small table near the window with the care of a man performing a service he considers important. He stood beside her at the window and looked out at the frost. "Well," he said. "You said that on a Saturday in October 6 years ago," Clara said. "In your front room, sitting across from me." "It bears repeating," Thomas said. He handed her a cup. "How are you?" She considered the question with her customary honesty. "I am," she paused. "I am not certain there is a word for it. In any of the languages we have between us." Thomas nodded, as though this were a perfectly satisfactory answer, which for him it was. They stood together in the early light and drank their tea and looked out at the frosted grounds of Ashworth Hall, where Clara had arrived 20 years ago as a girl of 16 with her father's precision and her mother's patience and no particular expectation of anything except the work, and where she had been, in every sense that she now understood the word, maid. She would have been pleased, Thomas said quietly. Clara did not need to ask who he meant. "I know," she said. "I think she planned it." Thomas smiled. "I think she did too." The Ashworth Chapel was small. It had been built in the 16th century and had been modified only in the direction of simplicity over the intervening 300 years. so that it retained the low, honest quality of a space that had been used for genuine occasions for a very long time and had been worn by that use into something more comfortable and more true than grandeur. It held 40 people at full capacity. Today, it held 12. Thomas, who was giving her away with a dignity that made her love him more than she had words for. Mrs. Penworth, who had cried already twice before the service began and was managing the third occurrence with the fierce, repressive energy that had characterized her response to emotion for the 24 years she had served the Ashworth household. Peters, who was no longer 18 and no longer a night footman, but had risen, in the years since the pipe burst, to the position of head footman, and who was standing in the third pew with the expression of a man attending an occasion he considers personally vindicating. Mrs. Hartley, precise and warm. Bramley, who had arranged his expression into one of professional composure, and whose eyes were slightly too bright for the composure to be entirely successful. The Dowager was not present. This was, by mutual and unspoken agreement, acceptable. She had not been implacable. That was the truth, and Clara was committed to the truth about it even when the comfortable version was available. The Dowager had been difficult, and then very difficult, and then, in the spring of 1850, at a dinner that the Duke had arranged with the specific and deliberate patience of a man dismantling a wall one stone at a time, she had sat across the table from Clara and conducted the conversation of a woman who has decided, after a long campaign, to change her position, not to admit defeat, which was not a concept the Dowager recognized, but to reassess the strategic landscape and act accordingly. She had not, since that dinner, actively opposed the match. She had not attended the wedding. These two facts occupied, in Clara's estimation, different moral categories, and she assigned to each its appropriate weight, and no more. The others in the chapel were people of Clara's choosing. Two women from the village with whom she had maintained genuine friendships over the years of her service at the Hall, a retired schoolmaster who had loaned her books when she first arrived in England as a 7-year-old who could not yet read English, and had told her, when she returned them a week later having read them, that she was going to be all right in this country, and who had been correct. Edmund Hale was not present, because she had written to him in the spring to tell him the date, not from cruelty or from a misguided sense of disclosure, but because she had considered his absence from her knowledge to be a debt she wanted to clear. And he had written back from Bristol, where he had a thriving practice and a new wife whom he described with a warm, uncomplicated happiness that had made Clara, reading his letter in the rose garden on a Thursday morning, feel the full, releasing gladness of a genuinely good outcome. He had wished her joy. She had believed him. The Duke was waiting at the altar when she came in. He was wearing dark blue, not matching, not coordinated, simply the coincidence of two people who had known each other long enough to develop, without discussion, a shared aesthetic language for the things that mattered. He was 47 years old, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had arrived somewhere after a very long journey and was only now, standing at the destination, beginning to understand that the journey had been worth it. He turned when she entered. The chapel was small enough that she could see his face clearly from the door, could see the moment he saw her, and what that moment did to his expression, and the fact that he made no effort to contain what it did, which was itself the thing that moved her most. Not the feeling. She had known about the feeling for a long time. The not containing it. The choosing on this morning to simply let it be visible. After 10 years of composure and containment and the meticulous management of everything he felt, he was standing at an altar in a small chapel and letting her see it. And that act of exposure, voluntary, deliberate, and entirely without armor, was the most intimate thing she had ever witnessed. Thomas placed her hand in the Duke's. Edward's hand. She had known his hands for years, had observed them in household reviews and across dining tables and in the library and in the rose garden, the hands of a man who worked and read and managed and rode and had never, in 10 years of proximity, touched hers, closed around her fingers with a steadiness that was also, unmistakably, a kind of relief. The chaplain began. She was aware of the words, had been aware of them in advance, had read them with the thoroughness she brought to all things she was going to commit to, which meant she had understood them before today and understood them differently now, in the specific gravity of the moment, the way that words read in the abstract and words spoken aloud in a particular room at a particular hour acquired different weight, different texture, different truth. She heard them, and she meant them with a complete, deliberate, eyes-open quality, that she meant all the things she committed to, not the meaning of people who have not considered the difficulty, but the meaning of people who have considered it at length and decided that the difficulty is not a reason. When it was her turn to speak, she spoke clearly and without hesitation. When it was his turn, Edward Ashworth's voice was entirely steady. She noted this, not with surprise, because steadiness was the most fundamental thing about him, but with the particular appreciation of a woman who knows what steadiness costs a person and what it means when they give it to something. He slid the ring onto her finger. She looked at it, a simple gold band, unadorned, chosen with the same instinct for what was real over what was merely impressive, that had, she understood now, always been present in him underneath the architecture of the Duke, waiting to be trusted enough to surface. He had shown her the ring 3 weeks before the wedding, which was not a conventional approach to the tradition of the ring, but was entirely characteristic of the man who had made a dry observation in February and then watched to see if she had caught it. She had caught it. She looked up from the ring to his face. He was already looking at her. In the small chapel, with its handful of witnesses, and its 300 years of genuine occasions, and its frostlight coming through the low windows, they looked at each other with the full, unguarded attention of two people who have finally, after everything, arrived at the same place at the same time and are choosing, with complete awareness, of what the choice costs, and what it is worth, to be there. The chaplain said the words that concluded the ceremony. Mrs. Penworth cried. She denied it afterward with her customary ferocity. Peters looked vindicating. Bramley's composure did not survive. Thomas stood with his hands clasped and his gray eyes bright and the expression of a man who is deeply, completely, and without complication happy for someone he loves. Outside the chapel, in the frost-covered grounds of Ashworth Hall, Edward took Clara's hand. Not formally, not for the benefit of witnesses, but with the simple, private directness of a man performing an action that is only for the two of them. And they stood for a moment in the winter air with the estate around them. She thought of the first morning she had come here. The girl of 16 with her father's precision, and no English beyond what she had taught herself from the books the schoolmaster had loaned her, standing at the servants' entrance of the largest house she had ever seen, and taking its measure with the gray eyes that saw considerably more than most people's gray eyes saw. She thought of Catherine, of the warmth and the wisdom and the final extraordinary act of love that had been the deathbed chamber and the candlelight and the voice spending its last reserves on a knowledge she had held alone and was determined, in the time remaining to her, to share. She thought of Edmund in Bristol, with his new wife and his honest face, and the Saturday walks that had been real and good and had given her, among other things, the knowledge of what she was choosing when she chose differently. She thought of a library at 4 in the morning, and a rose garden in June, and a dry observation in February that had taken 1 second to resolve, and the 3 sleepless nights of a man finally cornered in the only room left in the building, and a garden in October where she had stood with her hands not entirely steady, and let them be. She thought of 10 years. 10 years. Edward's hand tightened slightly around hers, not dramatically, not with the performed quality of a man making a statement, but with the small, specific, unglamorous warmth of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and intends to hold it. She looked up at him. Well, she said. He looked at her with the expression she had learned, was still learning, to read. The expression that existed in the space between the Duke and the man underneath the Duke, the expression that was entirely his and entirely hers and had been waiting. She understood now for exactly this. Well, he said. And they walked together through the frost-covered grounds of Ashworth Hall, past the carriage drive oaks and the formal gardens and the east wing where the ceiling had once come down and the world had rearranged itself in the small hours of a January night, toward whatever came next, with a particular and unhurried confidence of people who have taken the long way to where they were going and have decided, having arrived, that the long way was not a detour, but the journey itself. Behind them, the chapel door stood open. Inside, on the third pew, Peters was still looking vindicating. There is a particular kind of knowledge that women like Clara Voss carry through their lives, not the knowledge of books or ledgers or the organizational intelligence that makes large houses run, but the knowledge of themselves, the specific and hard-won understanding of what they are and what they feel, and what they will and will not permit, earned not through ease, but through the sustained, daily practice of being honest in a world that offers considerable incentive for the opposite. She had been honest about most things for most of her life. She had not always been honest about this. She understood this now, sitting at the writing table in what had been the East guest room and was now her own sitting room, on the evening of the 23rd of November, 1853, with a fire in the grate and Edward somewhere downstairs dealing with a letter from his parliamentary committee that had arrived, with the impeccable timing of parliamentary correspondence, on the morning of their wedding, and that he had set aside with the decisive firmness of a man establishing a precedent about what takes priority. She understood now that there had been a period of her life, longer than she could entirely account for with comfort, during which she had been rigorously honest about everything except the thing that mattered most. She had known, she thought, not from the beginning. She was not going to revise the history into something more dramatic or more inevitable than it had actually been. She had not looked at the Duke of Ashworth across the deathbed chamber in the winter of 1843 and known. She had been 26 years old and consumed with grief for the woman she was losing, and the Duke had been a figure of authority and composure and a particular quality of contained, unreachable remove that had, at that stage of her life, registered primarily as a professional characteristic rather than a human one. But earlier than she had admitted, that was the honest accounting. She had known something was different in the winter of 1845, 2 years after Catherine's death, when she had been conducting the quarterly accounts review and had made an error, a small one, a transposed figure in the tenancy column, that she had caught herself in the same moment the Duke's eye had gone to it, and he had looked up from a ledger, with an expression that was not the expression of a man noting a subordinate's mistake, but the expression of a man registering that the person across from him was capable of finding her own errors before he found them. And she had seen in his face, clearly and unmistakably, a quality of attention that was not professional. She had filed it. She had filed it in the place with no label and no key, and she had moved on to the next column, and she had not taken it out again for a very long time. She had known something was different in the summer of 1846, when she had been cutting the first roses of the season, and had turned to find him watching from the doorway of the garden with an expression she had no professional category for. And she had gone inside with her basket, and had stood in the flower room for a long moment before she arranged them, not because she had forgotten how to arrange roses, but because she needed the moment, the single unremarkable moment of standing alone in a room with her own heartbeat, before she could trust herself to continue. She had filed that too. She had been, she understood now, an extraordinary filer. A woman of considerable organizational intelligence had turned that intelligence, for the better part of a decade, to the systematic suppression of the most significant things she felt, and had done so with such thorough efficiency that even she had believed, most of the time, in the filing. She had believed in it until the January night with the burst pipe, when they had worked side by side through the small hours, and he had looked at her over the rescued volumes with the expression of a man registering something he had not expected. And she had felt the filed things strain against their containment with a force that had, for the first time, made her genuinely uncertain of the infrastructure. She had believed in it until the summer morning in the rose garden, when he had sat on the low stone bench and simply not left, and the world had continued around them with its bird song and its early light, and its complete indifference to what was happening between two people who were not, technically, doing anything at all. She had believed in it until February, until one dry observation and 1 second of resolution and the particular quality of his watching to see if she caught it. And then she had believed in it less well and less consistently than before, though she had continued the practice with everything available to her. She had believed in it most strenuously of all in the months of Edmund's courtship, which was, she recognized now, itself informative, the additional effort required to maintain the filing during a period when she was deliberately, honestly, and genuinely investing her attention in a different direction. The effort should not have been necessary. She had known that it was necessary. She had not followed that knowledge to its conclusion. Edmund. She thought of him with the warm, clear-eyed regard of a woman who has been honest about what he was to her, and is at peace with both the truth and the consequence of it. He had been real. What she had felt in his company had been real, The warmth, the ease, the uncomplicated pleasure of a person who asked nothing of her that she could not straightforwardly give. She did not revise that reality in the light of what it followed. It stood on its own as what it had been, something genuine and good that had, in the specific and irreducible way of things that are genuine and good, clarified rather than confused the thing she had been filing. Because the thing she had felt for Edmund, warm, comfortable, present, and entirely manageable, had been the precise contrast that had finally, in the honesty of comparison, named what she felt for Edward, which was none of those things, which was, in fact, the opposite of manageable, which was the thing she had been managing for years without naming it, and which the contrast of something genuinely manageable had rendered, at last, undeniable. She had known, she thought. She had known in the churchyard gate moment, standing across from Edmund's honest face and his uncomplicated hope, that the warmth she felt was real, and that it was not the whole of what she was capable of feeling, and that the difference between the two was the truest thing she had encountered in a long time. She had known in Thomas's garden, when Edward had crossed the distance between them with his face open and the armor gone, and said her name, just her name, without the miss, without the rank, without the professional distance that had structured every syllable between them for 10 years. And she had felt the filed things move with the force of something that has been contained beyond its capacity and is, finally, past containing. She had known at the writing table on a Thursday evening, when she had written the letter withdrawing her notice with the hand that was not entirely steady, and had understood, watching her own hand, that the unsteadiness was not grief or confusion, but something she had not permitted herself in a very long time. It was hope. The specific, terrifying, entirely involuntary hope of a woman who has spent a decade being practical about the impossible and has discovered, at the cost of considerable organizational effort, that the impossible has quietly become possible while she was looking the other way. She thought about Catherine. She came back to Catherine the way she always came back to her, not with the acute, raw grief of the early years, which had softened over time into something more complex and more gentle, the grief that becomes gratitude, the loss that becomes a different kind of presence. She came back to her with the specific, wondering regard of a woman who understands, only now, the full extent of what she was given. Catherine had known. Clara was certain of this, with a certainty that required no evidence beyond the memory of that final night. The way Catherine's eyes had moved between them in the candlelit chamber, the particular quality of her voice, when she said Clara's name as though it were a complete sentence, the precision of the request she had made, which was not the impulsive gesture of a woman in extremity, but the deliberate, clear-eyed act of someone who had spent years watching two people be obtuse about each other and had decided, in the time remaining to her, to do something about it. She had not asked Edward to love Clara. She had not been foolish enough or romantic enough to ask for something that could not be manufactured from obligation. She had asked him to see her. She had spent her last reserves on the single instruction that, if followed, would do the rest of its own accord. Look at her, Edward. Actually look. It had taken him 7 years after she said it. Clara found she could not, in the end, hold this against him. She had her own timeline to account for, and her own timeline was not, under honest examination, significantly more efficient. They had been, she thought, equally and differently blind. He from the architecture of suppression built over 40 years of aristocratic conditioning. She from the architecture of practical self-protection built over 20 years of knowing exactly what she was, and what she was not, and what the world would and would not permit. They had both been wrong about what the world would permit. He had been magnificently, immovably, characteristically wrong about it. Had stood in the path of every social and familial consequence of his choice with the same steadiness he brought to everything, the steadiness that had seemed, for so long, like distance, and had turned out to be the most fundamental expression of who he was. He had not flinched. He had not qualified. He had not offered her a version of commitment that had a door in the back for his own convenience. He had simply continued, with the focused and complete and entirely undramatic consistency of a man who has made a decision and considers the making of it sufficient. She had watched him do this. She had watched him do it through the Whisper Mills, and the Dowager, and the London pamphlets, and the withdrawn invitations, and the parliamentary colleagues, who had greeted the news with a carefully managed discomfort of men who considered the Duke's choice a social irregularity they were not sure how to process. She had watched him meet all of it with the same expression, not defiant, not performative, simply present and unmoved, the expression of a man for whom the opinion of people who did not know her was genuinely, completely, and without effort irrelevant. This was, she had realized somewhere in the winter of 1851, the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed. Not the declaration in Thomas's garden, though that had been. She could admit this now, in the privacy of her own sitting room on the evening of her own wedding day, one of the most significant moments of her adult life. Not the letter withdrawing her notice, or the Thursday afternoon in the study when she had placed the second letter on his desk and told him he could begin by not calling her Miss Voss. Those moments were the architecture of what had happened between them. The romance, the actual, specific, irreducible romance, was in the years of watching him be exactly who he had said he was. He had come downstairs. She heard him in the corridor, the familiar quality of his step. She had known his step for 10 years, could identify it from 2 floors away and around a corner, which was a piece of knowledge she had filed along with everything else, and was now, finally, permitted to simply have. He knocked on the sitting room door. "Come in," she said. He came in. He had shed the parliamentary letter along with his coat, apparently, and was carrying 2 glasses of wine with the domestic simplicity of a man performing an action that is entirely new and entirely natural, and that represents, in its very ordinariness, the whole of what the day has meant. He set 1 glass on the writing table beside her and took the chair across from her with the ease of a man settling into a room that is his and hers, and both of theirs together. He looked at her. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She considered the question. The fire. The frost outside the window. The writing table with its locked bottom drawer, which he had brought from the housekeeper's room, and which sat now in this different room with its lock and its contents intact, because some things are kept not from necessity, but from the understanding that the keeping itself is meaningful. "Catherine," she said. He nodded slowly. No complication in it, no guilt, no defensiveness. The nod of a man who understands that she is present in this room tonight, and that her presence is not a shadow, but a grace. "I think she knew," Clara said. "I think she knew everything," Edward said. "She generally did. She knew you better than you knew yourself." "That was not a high bar in those years," he said, with the dry precision that had taken 1 second to resolve in February of 1847, and that she now understood she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. She smiled. He saw her smile, and something in his face did the thing it did, the thing she had no word for, the thing that was entirely his and entirely hers, and had been waiting in the deepest and most inaccessible room of both of them for exactly this. She would have been happy, Clara said. "About today." "Yes," he said. "She would." They sat in the warmth of the fire with their wine and the frost outside the window and the whole long, improbable, unglamorous, extraordinary history of how they had arrived at this room in this moment. 10 years of proximity and patience and willful blindness and slow, costly, irreversible clarity. 10 years of filed things and rose gardens and library nights and burst pipes and dry observations and a deathbed chamber where a woman had spent her last reserves of breath on the truest thing. She knew. Outside, the estate was dark and frost-covered and entirely at peace. Inside, the fire burned quietly, and 2 people who had taken the long way sat together in the particular warmth of people who have finally, completely, and without reservation, arrived. Clara looked at him. She thought of the girl of 16 at the servants' entrance, with her father's precision and her mother's patience, and her gray eyes that saw considerably more than most people's gray eyes saw. That girl had walked into this house and stayed for 20 years and lost and found and worked and waited and filed and, finally, at the cost of considerable organizational effort, and 1 burst pipe and 2 letters and a garden in October and the honest, undefended face of a man who had taken 10 years to find the door and then walk through it without looking back, arrived here. At this fire, this room, this man. She had known, she thought. Not from the beginning, but earlier than she had admitted. She had known. And the knowing, the long, patient, unglamorous, extraordinary knowing, had been, in the end, exactly enough.